Hi guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Tonight we're doing something a little different. Go ahead and dim those lights. Maybe grab a warm drink. Get comfortable under your blanket. We're going on a journey through some of the strangest, darkest nights in medieval American history. And yes, I know what you're thinking. Medieval America. But here's the thing. When European colonizers showed up in the Americas, they brought their medieval mindsets with them. We're talking about those early colonial years, the 1500s through the early 1700s, when life after sunset was absolutely terrifying in ways we can barely imagine today. This isn't going to be your typical horror story. We're not here for jump scares or dramatic music. Instead, we're going to slowly walk through the actual experiences of people who lived through nights that would make our modern problems seem pretty tame. We're talking about survival in the literal sense, about the things people did when darkness fell and there was no electricity, no police force, no emergency services. Just you, the night, and whatever was out there with you. So settle in. This is going to be a long one. We're going to meet colonists who spent entire nights hiding in silence. Indigenous people who used the cover of darkness for resistance that history tried to forget. Enslaved people who risked everything for a few hours of freedom after sunset. And regular folks who just tried not to die before morning came. Let's start in Jamestown, Virginia, in the winter of 1609. Historians call it the starving time, which is putting it mildly. But what most history books skip over is what the nights were like during those months. Because the days were bad enough, sure. But when the sun went down, that's when things got truly medieval. The Jamestown colony was barely hanging on. Of the roughly 500 colonists who were there when winter started, only about 60 would survive until spring. The numbers are horrifying enough on their own, but let's talk about what actually happened when darkness fell during those months. John Smith had left. The guy who'd been keeping some semblance of order was gone, and the colony descended into chaos. The fort walls were supposed to protect them, but here's the thing about fort walls. They keep things out, yes, but they also keep things in. And during the starving time, what was inside those walls was often worse than what was outside. People were starving, obviously. The name kind of gives it away. But starvation does weird things to the human mind, especially at night when you're lying there in the dark, listening to your stomach eat itself. The colonists had eaten through all their livestock pretty quickly. Then they ate the horses, then the dogs, then the cats, then the rats. And when those ran out, they started looking at each other differently. There's this account from George Percy, who was the president of the colony during this time. And Percy was not a guy prone to exaggeration or drama. He was pretty matter-of-fact in his writing, which somehow makes it worse. He described how one man killed his pregnant wife while she slept, then chopped her up and started salting her body parts to preserve them for food. The guy had eaten part of her before anyone found out. Now, imagine being one of the other colonists in that fort. Imagine lying there at night, in the dark, knowing that happened. Knowing that someone you'd been living with, someone you'd shared meals with, had done that. And wondering if you might be next. Or worse, wondering if you might be driven to do the same thing. The nights during the starving time weren't about ghost stories or supernatural fears. They were about the very real terror of what desperate humans become when pushed to their absolute limit. People stopped sleeping in groups. They started barricading themselves in individual spaces. Some accounts mention people tying themselves to posts or walls so they wouldn't be dragged away while they slept. But here's what gets me about these Jamestown nights: the silence. Several accounts mention how quiet it got. In a fort with dozens of people, you'd expect noise. Crying, praying, talking, something. But people learned pretty quickly that making noise at night was dangerous. It attracted attention. It let others know where you were, whether you were awake or asleep, whether you were weak or strong. So they stayed silent, just the sound of their own breathing in the dark. Maybe the occasional creak of wood or rustle of movement, but mostly silence. The kind of silence that makes you question whether you're alone or whether someone's standing right next to you in the darkness, waiting. There was this one woman, we don't know her name, but Percy mentions her in his writings. She'd lost her husband early in the winter, probably to disease, though it could have been starvation or violence. Doesn't really matter. Point is, she was alone, and she spent every night of that winter sitting in the corner of one of the communal buildings with a knife in her hand, just waiting for morning. She didn't sleep. At least, that's what the survivors said. She just sat there, night after night, absolutely silent, with that knife ready. When dawn came, she'd put the knife down, try to find something to eat, and then when sunset approached, she'd go back to her corner and pick up the knife again. She survived, made it through to spring when the supply ships finally came. But according to the accounts, she never really came back from those nights. Spent the rest of her life, however long that was, unable to sleep in the dark. Would stay up all night, every night, just sitting and waiting. That's the thing about these medieval American nights that history books skip over. They weren't just dangerous or scary. They fundamentally broke something in the people who survived them, changed them in ways they could never really articulate or recover from. Let's drift over to New Mexico now, to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. This is one of those events that doesn't get nearly enough attention in American history classes, which is a shame because it was one of the most successful indigenous uprisings against European colonization in North America. But we're not here for the broad strokes of history. We're here for the nights. Specifically, the night of August 9th, 1680, and the nights leading up to it. The Spanish had been in New Mexico for about 80 years at this point. They'd done what Spanish colonizers did everywhere: forced conversions to Christianity, destroyed indigenous religious sites, enslaved people through the encomienda system, and generally made life absolutely miserable for the Pueblo people. But the Pueblo communities had been planning, quietly, secretly, for years, and the planning happened at night, because of course it did. Daytime was for the performance of subjugation. Night was when resistance could breathe. There was a man named Pepe, a religious leader from Oque Oinje Pueblo. The Spanish had arrested him and others for practicing their traditional religion, publicly whipped them and imprisoned them. Pepe survived that, got released, and decided enough was enough. But organizing a revolt across dozens of Pueblo communities spread across hundreds of miles, all while under Spanish surveillance, that takes some serious nighttime coordination. The Pueblo people used runners, messengers who traveled at night, moving from Pueblo to Pueblo with information and plans. These runners knew the landscape in ways the Spanish couldn't match. They knew where to move in darkness, how to avoid patrols, which paths were safe when you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Imagine being one of those runners. You're carrying information that could get you and everyone you love killed if you're caught. You're moving through desert terrain at night. No light, just memorized paths, and maybe starlight if you're lucky. You can't make noise, can't risk a fire, can't even really rest because you have to make it to the next Pueblo before dawn. And you're doing this knowing that if you mess up, if you get caught, the Spanish won't just kill you. They'll torture you first, make an example of you, display your body where everyone can see what happens to people who resist. But these runners did it anyway. Night after night, they carried knotted cords between the pueblos. The cords were a timing mechanism. Each knot represented a day. When you got down to the last knot, that's when the revolt would begin. Simultaneously, across all the pueblos at once. The night before the revolt, August 9th, must have been something else. All across New Mexico, Pueblo people went to bed knowing that when the sun came up, everything was going to change. They were either going to free themselves or die trying. There wasn't really a middle ground. Some of them probably didn't sleep at all. Just lay there in the darkness, thinking about what morning would bring. Others might have slept deeply, gathering strength for what was coming. But all of them had to stay silent about it. Couldn't let the Spanish suspect anything. Couldn't give the game away when they were this close. There's this account from one of the Spanish survivors, a guy named Antonio de Otterman, who was the governor at the time. He described waking up that morning to chaos. Pueblo people attacking Spanish settlements all across the region at the same time. He couldn't understand how it had been coordinated, how they'd managed to organize something this big without Spanish intelligence catching wind of it. The answer, of course, was the nights. All those silent nights of planning and preparation. All those runners moving in darkness. All those conversations held in whispers after the Spanish had gone to bed. The revolt succeeded, by the way. The Pueblo people drove the Spanish completely out of New Mexico. It took the Spanish 12 years to reconquer the region. And even then, they had to make serious concessions. The Pueblo Revolt stands as one of the most successful indigenous resistances to European colonization in American history. But it started in the silence of those nighttime planning sessions, in the courage of those runners who moved through darkness carrying knotted cords, in the discipline of thousands of people who kept a secret through countless nights, when one slip, one overheard conversation, one moment of carelessness could have destroyed everything. Let's float down south now, to the Caribbean, to Jamaica in the early 1700s. We need to talk about the Maroons, and specifically about a woman named Nanny, though that might not have been her real name. Enslaved people who escaped often took new names, shedding their slave names like old skin. The Maroons were communities of escaped enslaved people who lived in the mountains of Jamaica. They'd built entire towns up there, hidden in the dense forest where British colonial forces couldn't easily reach them. And they didn't just hide. They raided plantations, freed other enslaved people, and generally made life difficult for the British. Nanny was a leader of one of these Maroon communities, and while there are plenty of stories about her that are probably embellished or mythologized, what we know for sure is that she was incredibly skilled at nighttime operations. Shadows and secrets, the thing about escaping slavery in colonial Jamaica wasn't just the physical act of running away. That was hard enough. You had to get past overseers, past dogs, past the very real threat of being shot on sight if you were caught. But even if you made it off the plantation, you then had to survive in terrain you probably didn't know, find the Maroon communities hidden in the mountains, and convince them to take you in, all while being hunted. And almost all of this happened at night, because trying to escape during the day was basically suicide. You'd be spotted immediately. So enslaved people who made the decision to run did it after dark, when the overseers were theoretically asleep and the darkness could hide your movement. Nanny and her community developed this whole system for guiding escapees to safety. They used drums, but not in the way you might think. The British knew about drum communication and tried to ban it, but sound travels weird in mountains at night. The Maroons would play drums that sounded like they were coming from one direction when they were actually positioned somewhere else entirely. They'd create acoustic illusions to mislead British patrols while guiding escapees along the actual safe routes. There are these accounts from British soldiers who tried to track down Maroon settlements at night. And the accounts are fascinating because these were professional soldiers, guys who'd fought in European wars, who thought they knew what they were doing. But they'd get into those Jamaican mountains after dark and just become completely disoriented. One soldier described it as being swallowed by the darkness. The jungle canopy was so thick that even on nights with a full moon, almost no light reached the ground. You literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and the sounds were overwhelming. Insects, birds, animals you couldn't identify. Every noise could be a Maroon warrior about to attack, or just a parrot having a midnight conversation. The British soldiers had to stay together, had to keep talking to each other so they wouldn't get separated in the darkness, which of course meant they were easy to track. Meanwhile, the Maroons moved through that same darkness in complete silence. They knew every path, every tree, every rock. They could navigate by touch and sound alone. Nanny supposedly trained people in this. New escapees who made it to the Maroon settlements had to learn how to move in darkness like the Maroons did. It wasn't optional. Your survival and everyone else's survival depended on it. So you'd spend nights just walking through the forest, learning to feel your way, learning to identify sounds, learning to move without making noise. There's this one story about a group of escaped enslaved people who made it to Nanny's settlement. about 15 people, including some children. They'd run from a plantation on the coast and traveled for 3 nights to reach the mountains. By the time they arrived, they were exhausted, starving, and some were injured. But Nanny wouldn't let them rest. Not yet. First night in the settlement, she took them back out into the forest, told them they needed to learn the paths immediately because British soldiers could attack at any time, and they needed to be able to run and hide without hesitation. So these people who'd just completed this harrowing escape, who hadn't slept properly in days, had to spend another night stumbling through dark jungle learning escape routes. One of the children, a boy maybe 8 or 9 years old, kept crying. Not loudly, just quiet sobs. He was tired and scared, and probably just wanted to sleep somewhere safe. Nanny carried that boy on her back while continuing to lead the group through the darkness. Didn't say anything about the crying, didn't tell him to be quiet. Just let him cry it out while she navigated them through paths that would save their lives if British soldiers came. By dawn, the group had memorized 3 different escape routes leading away from the settlement. They were even more exhausted than before, but now they had a chance at survival. And that boy stopped crying. Accounts say he grew up to become one of the settlement scouts, someone who moved through nighttime jungle like a ghost. That's what survival looked like in these contexts. It wasn't dramatic or heroic in the traditional sense. It was exhausted people pushing themselves beyond what they thought possible because the alternative was death or worse. The Maroons fought the British for decades, and while there were daytime skirmishes and battles, the real war happened at night. In the silence and darkness, where the Maroons had every advantage and the British had none. Eventually, the British gave up trying to defeat the Maroons militarily. They signed treaties recognizing Maroon independence. It was one of the few times enslaved people in the Americas successfully fought their way to freedom and had it legally recognized. And it happened because of those nights, because of people like Nanny who turned darkness into a weapon and a shelter. Let's drift north now, back to the mainland, to Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692. You know where this is going. The witch trials. But again, we're not here for the courtroom drama or the daytime accusations. We're here for the nights. Because here's what made the Salem witch trials particularly nightmarish. The fear didn't stop when the sun went down. If anything, it got worse. During the day, you could at least see who was watching you, who might be ready to accuse you next. But at night, in the dark, anyone could be standing outside your window. Anyone could be listening to what you said in your own home. The trials started in January and ran through September. 9 months of escalating paranoia and accusations. And every single night of those 9 months, people in Salem went to bed not knowing if they'd wake up accused of witchcraft. There was a woman named Rebecca Nurse. She was 71 years old, well respected in the community, a church member in good standing. By all accounts, she was exactly the kind of person you'd think would be safe from accusation. She was not safe. The night before Rebecca was arrested, she apparently couldn't sleep. Her family later testified about this. She stayed up all night praying, pacing, trying to understand what was happening to her community, because she'd seen what was happening. Neighbors accusing neighbors, friends turning on friends, and she could feel it coming for her. Her family tried to reassure her, told her she was being paranoid. She was a respected elder. She'd lived a good Christian life. Nobody would accuse her. They actually told her to get some sleep, stop worrying so much. The next morning, the constable showed up to arrest her for witchcraft. Multiple people had accused her, including some of the supposedly afflicted girls who were at the center of the accusations. Imagine what that night must have been like for Rebecca. Lying in the darkness, knowing something terrible was coming, but having everyone tell you you're imagining it. Feeling the weight of this inexplicable dread and having nowhere to put it, nothing to do with it except wait. And then being proven right in the worst possible way. Rebecca was eventually hanged. Despite her reputation, despite her age, despite her family's efforts to defend her, they hanged a 71-year-old woman because of accusations that, even by the standards of the time, made no sense. But before she was hanged, she spent months in prison. And the conditions in those prisons were medieval in the most literal sense. Dark, filthy, cold, people were chained. They weren't given adequate food or water. Many of them, especially the older prisoners, died in custody before they could even be tried. The nights in those prisons were their own special kind of hell. You're chained in the dark with other accused people. Some of them are children. Some are your neighbors. Some are strangers. And all of you are there because of accusations that range from the absurd to the tragic. There's an account from Sarah Good, another accused woman. She was pregnant when she was arrested, gave birth in prison. The baby died. Sarah eventually was hanged, but before that, she spent months in prison darkness, nursing and then losing her infant in conditions that would make modern prisons look like luxury hotels. The night that baby died, the other prisoners could hear Sarah crying. Not sobbing, not wailing. Just this quiet, continuous crying that went on for hours. And none of them could do anything. They were all chained. They couldn't reach her, couldn't comfort her, couldn't even clearly see her in the darkness. Just hear her grief echoing off stone walls. One of the other prisoners, a woman named Mary Warren, later testified about that night. She said the sound of Sarah's crying was worse than any of the supposed witchcraft she'd been accused of. Worse than the court proceedings. Worse than the uncertainty of not knowing if she'd be hanged. That sound of a mother grieving her baby in prison darkness was the thing that broke something in Mary's mind that never quite healed. Mary was one of the accusers, by the way. She was one of the afflicted girls pointing fingers at people. But then she tried to recant, tried to tell the truth about what was really happening, and immediately got accused herself and thrown in prison, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about how this whole thing worked. The nights of the Salem witch trials weren't about supernatural horror. They were about the very mundane horror of what humans do to each other when fear takes over. About sleeping in your own bed and wondering if morning will bring the constable to your door. About lying chained in darkness, listening to someone else's grief and knowing you might be next. trials eventually ended. People came to their senses, or at least some version of it, but the damage was done. 19 people hanged. At least 5 died in prison. Countless lives destroyed by accusation, even if they weren't executed. And an entire community that had to live with what they'd done, what they'd allowed to happen. Some of the accusers later recanted, said they'd been caught up in mass hysteria. Some claimed they'd been pressured or manipulated. One of them, Ann Putnam Jr., publicly apologized years later, said she'd been deluded by Satan, which is an interesting way to avoid taking personal responsibility. But whatever helps you sleep at night, I guess. The one wonders if Ann Putnam actually did sleep well at night after that. If any of the accusers did, whether they lay in darkness thinking about the people they'd sent to their deaths, whether they heard Sarah Good's crying in their memories, whether Rebecca Nurse's face appeared in the shadows. The historical record doesn't tell us that part, doesn't tell us about the nights the accusers spent after the trials ended. But I imagine those nights were pretty rough. Let's move to a different kind of nighttime horror now. New France, which is what we now call parts of Canada and the northern United States, in the mid-1600s. We need to talk about the raids. The French colonists in New France had this complicated relationship with the indigenous peoples of the region. Sometimes they were allies, especially in the fur trade. Sometimes they were enemies. And sometimes, honestly, it depended on the day and who you asked. But there were these raids. Iroquois Confederacy warriors would attack French settlements, usually at night. And the French would retaliate with their own raids on Iroquois villages. Back and forth, year after year, decade after decade. And the nighttime nature of these raids added this extra layer of psychological terror that's hard to overstate. The long watches, there was a settlement called Lachine, near what's now Montreal. In August of 1689, it got hit by one of the most devastating raids in New France history. About 1,500 Iroquois warriors attacked in the middle of the night. The settlers had no warning. 1 minute, they were asleep. The next minute, their homes were on fire, and they were fighting for their lives in the darkness. The thing about nighttime raids is that they completely disorient the people being attacked. You wake up to chaos, smoke and fire and screaming, and you can't see what's happening. Can't tell how many attackers there are. Can't organize a defense because you can't find the other defenders in the darkness. Can't even figure out which direction is safe to run. The Lachine raid killed somewhere between 90 and 200 French settlers, depending on which account you read. Exact numbers are hard because many bodies were never found. Some people were taken captive. Some fled into the woods and died there. Some drowned trying to escape across the river in the dark. But here's what gets me. After the Lachine raid, the survivors and people in nearby settlements lived with this constant dread of nighttime. They knew another raid could come at any moment. They knew the attackers preferred darkness. They knew they might go to sleep and never wake up. So they developed these watch systems. Every night, someone had to stay awake. Every single night. They'd rotate the duty, but someone always had to be alert, listening, watching for any sign of an approaching raid. Imagine that. Imagine knowing that your survival depends on staying awake all night when it's your turn on watch. You can't doze off, can't let your attention wander, because if you do, everyone dies. Your family dies, your neighbors die, and it's your fault. There are records from settlements in New France of people who served on night watch, developing what we'd probably now recognize as severe anxiety and sleep disorders. They'd do their shift, staying up all night straining to hear sounds in the darkness. Then they'd try to sleep during the day, but they couldn't because they'd internalized this hypervigilance. They'd conditioned themselves to interpret every sound as a potential threat. One guy, we know him as Jacques, but no last name in the record, apparently went 2 weeks without sleeping more than an hour or two at a time. He'd done his night watch shifts and then couldn't turn it off, would just lie there during the day, exhausted, but unable to actually sleep because his mind kept insisting he needed to stay alert. Eventually, Jacques started hallucinating, seeing attackers that weren't there, hearing war cries in the wind. His family tried to help him, but they were all dealing with their own trauma and fear. The whole settlement was basically a collective nervous breakdown in slow motion. Jacques died, by the way, not in a raid. He fell off a roof while doing repairs, probably because he was so exhausted and disoriented from not sleeping that he lost his balance. So you could say the nighttime terror killed him, just not in the direct way you might expect. The French eventually negotiated some periods of peace with the Iroquois Confederacy. But even during peaceful times, the settlements kept their night watches, because trust is easy to lose and hard to rebuild, and nobody wanted to be caught unprepared if the peace broke down. Some of these watch systems continued for decades. People who'd been children during the raids grew up and had children of their own, and they still kept someone awake every night, just in case. The original trauma had become embedded in the culture of the settlement, became something they did even when the rational reason for it had faded. There's something deeply sad about that, about fear becoming so normalized that you can't let it go even when it might be safe to do so, about an entire community structured around the assumption that nighttime equals danger, always and forever. Let's drift to a different kind of nighttime survival now. The eastern seaboard, various colonies, throughout the 1600s and 1700s. We need to talk about maritime life, and specifically about the night watches on ships. Because here's something that doesn't get talked about much. A huge percentage of colonial trade and transportation happened on ships, and ships in the 1600s and 1700s were basically floating wooden boxes that could sink or catch fire or get attacked by pirates at any moment. Keeping them functional required constant work, day and night. Sailors had to maintain watch shifts all night, every night. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, or 6 on and 6 off, depending on the ship and the captain. And the night watches were dangerous in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. First, you're on a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean in complete darkness. If you fall overboard during the night watch, you're probably dead. The ship can't easily turn around in the dark. The crew can't see you in the water. Even if they could, the chances of actually finding you and getting you back on board are basically zero. So you fall overboard at night, you drown. That's just how it works. Second, you're trying to do complex physical labor in that darkness, climbing rigging, adjusting sails, checking lines. All of this requires you to move around the ship in ways that could get you killed if you misstep. And you're doing it tired because you've been rotating through these watch shifts for weeks or months, never getting a full night's sleep. There are so many accounts of sailors falling from rigging during night watches, just losing their grip or misplacing their foot in the darkness and falling to the deck below. If you were lucky, you died on impact. If you weren't lucky, you survived with broken bones and internal injuries and got to spend the rest of the voyage in agony in the ship's hold because there was no real medical care. One sailor, a guy named William Dampier, who wrote extensively about his voyages, described watching a shipmate fall from the rigging during a night watch. The guy screamed on the way down, hit the deck so hard that Dampier said he heard bones breaking from across the ship. And then the guy just lay there, still alive, making these wet breathing sounds that meant his lungs were filling with blood. They couldn't do anything for him. The ship's surgeon was asleep, and even if he'd been awake, there wasn't much he could have done with broken ribs puncturing lungs. So the crew on watch just had to listen to this guy dying slowly in the darkness while they continued doing their jobs. Because the ship doesn't stop needing to be sailed just because someone's dying on the deck. The guy apparently took about 3 hours to die. 3 hours of increasingly labored breathing and occasional moans of pain. And the night watch had to work through all of it, had to step around or over his body, had to hear it and smell it and just keep functioning because that's what survival at sea required. Dampier wrote that he never forgot those sounds, that for years afterward, he'd wake up at night thinking he heard that same wet breathing. His account is matter of fact, no melodrama, just describing it like you describe bad weather or a difficult sail, which somehow makes it more disturbing. But here's the thing about night watches on ships. As dangerous and terrible as they were, sailors preferred them to what happened when ships got becalmed at night. Being becalmed means there's no wind. The ship just sits there, dead in the water, going nowhere. During the day, this is boring and frustrating. At night, it's psychologically devastating. You're on a ship in the middle of the ocean. It's completely dark. There's no wind, so the ship isn't making the normal creaking and movement sounds that sailors get used to. It's just unnaturally still and quiet. And you're sitting there on watch, staring into darkness, and your mind starts playing tricks on you. Sailors reported seeing things during becalmed night watches. Lights on the water that weren't there, shapes moving in the darkness, hearing voices calling from the ocean. Now, some of this was probably actual phenomena. Bioluminescent plankton can create weird lights. Ocean sounds can carry in strange ways, but a lot of it was just exhausted, stressed minds filling the silence and darkness with something, anything, because the nothingness was unbearable. There are accounts of sailors jumping overboard during becalmed night watches, just standing up and stepping off the ship into the dark water. The other sailors on watch would hear the splash, would realize what happened, but couldn't see where the person was, couldn't save them even if they wanted to. One captain, his account is in the archives, described having to tie the night watch sailors to the mast during particularly long becalmed periods, not as punishment, as protection, because he'd had 3 men jump overboard during becalmed night watches on previous voyages, and he wasn't going to let it happen again. Imagine being tied to a mast for your entire night watch shift, unable to move freely, just standing there, tied up, staring into darkness, waiting for your 4 or 6 hours to be up. It's technically safer than being free to jump overboard, but it's its own kind of torture. The sailors understood why it was necessary. They didn't fight it. Some of them apparently requested to be tied up because they didn't trust themselves not to jump, which tells you something about the psychological state these night watches could induce. Ships would sometimes be becalmed for days or even weeks, meaning night after night of this, tied to the mast or carefully supervised, staring into darkness, hearing things that might or might not be real, slowly losing your grip on what's real and what's your mind breaking under the strain. When wind finally came and the ship started moving again, the sailors would often break down, just start crying or laughing hysterically, because the movement and sound meant their minds could finally relax slightly, could stop filling the silence with hallucinations and paranoia. Let's move to a different maritime nightmare now. Slave ships, the Middle Passage, the nighttime holds. I want to be clear about something before we get into this. The entire institution of slavery was an atrocity. Every aspect of it was designed to dehumanize and destroy. But the nighttime conditions on slave ships were particularly calculated in their cruelty. Enslaved people were kept in the holds of ships, chained, packed so tightly they couldn't move. And at night, the hatches were closed and locked, meaning the holds were completely dark. No light, no air circulation, just hundreds of people chained in darkness, lying in their own waste, unable to move, many of them sick, some dying. The smell alone was reportedly unbearable. Sailors on deck could smell the holds from above, said it was worse than anything else they'd encountered at sea, and these were people who were used to some pretty horrific smells. But we're talking about what the nights were like for the enslaved people in those holds, because that's what this script is about. The nighttime experiences, the survival and silence. The silence wasn't really silence. There were sounds, people crying quietly, people praying, people dying, the rattle of chains, the creak of the ship. But enslaved people learned quickly that making too much noise at night brought punishment. So they tried to stay quiet even while enduring unimaginable conditions. There are some accounts from enslaved people who survived the Middle Passage. Not many, because literacy rates among enslaved people were deliberately kept low, and most survivors were too traumatized to want to speak about it. But some accounts exist. One man, Alada Iquiano, wrote about the nighttime holds. He described feeling like he was suffocating, like the darkness was a physical weight pressing down on him. He talked about hearing other enslaved people lose their minds in that darkness, start screaming or laughing, or just making sounds that weren't quite human anymore. When people broke like that at night, the others couldn't help them, couldn't reach them because of the chains, couldn't comfort them, couldn't even clearly see them in the darkness. Just hear them breaking and know they might be next. The weight of darkness Equiano described one night when a woman near him started screaming. Not words, just this continuous scream that went on and on. The sailors eventually came down into the hold with lanterns and whips, beat her until she stopped screaming, then left, taking the light with them again. The woman died that night. Equiano could tell by the way the sounds changed around her. The breathing stopped. The slight movements of her body against his in the cramped space went still. And she just stayed there, chained among the living, until morning when the sailors came to remove the bodies. This happened regularly. People died at night in the holds and stayed there with the living until dawn. The other enslaved people had to spend the rest of the night knowing there was a corpse chained right next to them. Sometimes multiple corpses, just waiting for morning. Some enslaved people stopped sleeping entirely during the middle passage. Their bodies were too traumatized, their minds too alert to the constant danger and horror. They'd arrive at their destination, having not really slept for weeks or months, which of course made them seem broken or damaged to the enslavers, which affected their sale price, which the enslavers used to justify treating them even worse. The whole system was designed to break people, and the nighttime holds were a particularly effective tool for that breaking. Take away someone's ability to move, to see, to maintain basic dignity. Chain them in darkness with the dying and the dead. Do that night after night. See what's left of their mind when you finally let them out. But here's what the enslavers didn't count on: the human capacity for resistance, even in the most impossible circumstances. Because enslaved people used those nighttime holds for planning. They couldn't talk openly during the day when sailors could hear them, but at night, in the darkness, they could whisper, could pass information, could make plans. The darkness that was meant to break them also gave them cover. There were multiple revolts on slave ships during the Middle Passage. Enslaved people somehow managing to get free of their chains, overwhelm the crew, take control of the ship. Most of these revolts failed. The ones that succeeded usually ended with the ship running aground or the formerly enslaved people being recaptured. But they happened, despite the chains and the darkness and the impossible odds. And many of them were planned in those nighttime holds. People whispering in darkness, figuring out which sailors were sympathetic or at least less cruel, which times the guards changed, where weapons might be stored, how to pick locks or break chains. One successful revolt happened on a ship called the Amistad in 1839. That's technically outside our time period, but it's worth mentioning because it shows that this resistance continued for as long as the slave trade did. The enslaved people on the Amistad managed to free themselves from their chains at night, kill several crew members, and take control of the ship. They didn't know how to navigate back to Africa, so they forced the remaining crew to sail them there. The crew tricked them and ended up sailing to New York instead. But still, they did it. They used the nighttime, the chaos, the momentary advantage to try to free themselves. Most revolts didn't succeed like that. Most ended in mass death. But the fact that they kept happening, that enslaved people kept trying despite knowing the odds, tells you something about the human spirit that's worth remembering. The night holds couldn't completely break that spirit. The darkness couldn't fully extinguish the drive to resist, to survive, to maintain some shred of humanity and dignity. Let's move inland now, away from the coasts, deep into colonial territories, to the night experiences of people living on the frontier. And I use the word frontier carefully, because what was frontier to European colonists was home to indigenous peoples who'd lived there for thousands of years. But from the colonial perspective, these were dangerous edges of civilization, places where the colonial power structures were thin or non-existent, where nighttime meant something different than it did in Boston or Philadelphia. There's this account from a woman named Mary Rowlandson. In 1676, her town in Massachusetts got attacked by Wampanoag warriors during King Philip's War. Mary was taken captive along with her children and spent 11 weeks living with the Wampanoag. Her account of this experience is one of the most detailed captivity narratives we have from this period. And while the whole thing is worth reading if you're into this stuff, we're focused on what she wrote about the nights. Mary described the first night after being captured as the longest of her life. She was separated from most of her family. Her youngest daughter had been wounded in the attack and was dying. They were moving through forest at night, and Mary had no idea where they were going or what was going to happen to her. She was terrified. Obviously, she'd been raised on stories about indigenous people that were basically designed to make her terrified. And now she was living those stories. But the actual night, as she described it, wasn't quite what she'd been led to expect. The Wampanoag didn't torture her or abuse her that first night. They made camp. Some of them tried to help with her daughter's wounds. They gave her food. Not much, because they didn't have much, but they shared what they had. Her daughter died that night anyway. Mary held her while she died, sitting by a fire in the forest, surrounded by people she'd been taught to think of as savages. And those supposed savages let her grieve, didn't rush her or tell her to be quiet, just let her hold her dead child and cry. In the morning, they buried the child and moved on. Mary would spend the next several weeks moving with the Wampanoag, experiencing nights that challenged everything she thought she knew. Some nights were hard. They were all hungry. Resources were scarce because the war was devastating to everyone involved. Some nights, they barely had shelter. Some nights, Mary was so cold and tired she thought she'd die. But the Wampanoag women helped her, taught her how to survive in conditions that would have killed her otherwise, showed her how to find food in the forest, how to build shelters, how to stay warm, how to move quietly at night when they needed to avoid colonial forces. Mary's account is complicated because she was still fundamentally a colonial woman with colonial prejudices. She describes the Wampanoag in terms that are often dehumanizing. But at the same time, she's honest about the fact that they treated her better than she expected, that they shared their meager resources with her, that they protected her in some ways. The nights during her captivity, as she described them, were marked by this weird mixture of fear and unexpected kindness. She was a prisoner, yes, but she was also being kept alive by people who had every reason to hate her and everyone like her. One night stands out in her account. They were camped somewhere. She didn't know where. She was sitting by a fire with several Wampanoag women. None of them spoke English well enough to really communicate with her, and she didn't speak their language. But they sat together in the firelight, and one of the women started singing. Mary didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling. It was a sad song, a mourning song, and she realized these women had lost people too, had lost children and husbands and parents to this war, were grieving just like she was grieving. She wrote that she cried that night, sitting with those women, not from fear or cold or hunger, just from the overwhelming realization that grief is universal, that these people she'd been taught to see as less than human were experiencing the same losses and pain that she was. It didn't make her suddenly enlightened or anything. She still went back to colonial society afterward and wrote her captivity narrative in terms that reinforced colonial narratives about indigenous savagery. But she also included that detail about crying with those women by the fire. And I think that matters, because what we're talking about with these nighttime survival stories isn't just physical survival. It's the survival of some capacity for human connection, even in the most impossible circumstances, even across cultural divides designed to prevent that connection. Let's talk about another kind of frontier night experience: fur trappers and traders in the interior of the continent. These were mostly men, though not exclusively. They'd spend months or even years away from colonial settlements, living in the wilderness, interacting primarily with indigenous peoples. The night experiences of fur trappers are interesting because they were kind of caught between worlds. They weren't indigenous, but they weren't really living colonial lives either. They had to adapt to wilderness survival in ways that most colonists never did. There's this journal from a French fur trapper named Pierre Esprit Radisson. He trapped in the Great Lakes region and what's now Minnesota in the mid-1600s. His journals are chaotic and hard to follow, but they give us glimpses into what nighttime was like for trappers. Radisson described having to sleep outside most nights. Sometimes he'd build a shelter, but often he'd just find a spot and sleep on the ground. In winter, in Minnesota, which if you've never experienced a Minnesota winter, let me tell you, that's hardcore. He wrote about waking up covered in snow, about having to keep a fire going all night or risk freezing to death, about the constant awareness that wolves or bears could be nearby, about the sounds of the forest at night that he learned to interpret, which sounds were normal, which meant danger. But he also wrote about the beauty of it, the northern lights, the stars so bright and numerous that they cast actual shadows, the silence of snow falling in darkness. For Radisson, the nighttime wilderness wasn't just dangerous. It was also peaceful in ways that colonial settlements never were. He described one night when he was traveling with a group of indigenous hunters. They'd made camp and were sitting around a fire. One of the hunters started telling a story. Radisson didn't understand all the words, but he got the gist. It was a creation story about how the world came to be, about the animals and the spirits and the relationships between everything. Radisson wrote that listening to that story by firelight in the middle of the wilderness was one of the most spiritual experiences of his life, more meaningful than any church service he'd attended in France. The story connected him to the land in a way he'd never felt before. Of course, Radisson was also there to exploit that land for profit, to take furs that would be sold in European markets. So his spiritual experience was happening in the context of colonial extraction. But still, that moment of connection existed. That night, by the fire when boundaries blurred slightly, whispers in the cold fur trappers developed their own kind of nighttime survival skills. They learned from indigenous peoples, but also created their own adaptations. They'd cache supplies in hidden locations, marked by subtle signs that only other trappers could read. They'd create shelter systems that could be assembled quickly in darkness. They'd develop routes and safe spots memorized well enough to navigate by feel. But the psychological toll of those solitary nights was real. Radisson mentioned it in passing, but other trappers' journals elaborate. When you're alone in the wilderness for months, the nights start doing things to your mind. There was a trapper named John Coulter, active in the early 1800s, so a bit outside our main period, but his experiences mirror earlier trappers. He once spent an entire winter essentially alone in what's now Wyoming and Montana. His journal entries from that winter get progressively stranger as the isolation sets in. Early entries are straightforward: weather notes, trap locations, animal sightings. But by midwinter, he's writing about conversations he's having with himself, about hearing voices in the wind, about seeing figures moving in the darkness that disappear when he looks directly at them. Coulter knew these were hallucinations. He wrote about them with a kind of detached observation, like he was studying his own mind breaking down. But knowing they're hallucinations doesn't make them less real in the moment, doesn't make those nighttime hours less terrifying when your brain is generating threats that aren't there. Some trappers dealt with this by never being alone. They'd partner up specifically to avoid the isolation madness, having another person there, someone to talk to during the long dark hours, someone to confirm that what you're seeing is or isn't real, made the difference between surviving psychologically intact and coming back broken. But partnerships had their own nighttime tensions. When you're stuck in a small shelter with the same person for months, when you're both tired and hungry and cold and stressed, conflict is inevitable. And conflict at night, when you're trapped together in darkness, can turn dangerous fast. There are multiple accounts of trapping partnerships ending in violence. Partners killing each other over disputes that seem trivial in retrospect. Arguments about whose turn it was to tend the fire. Disagreements about which direction to travel next. Accusations of stealing food from shared supplies. One particularly grim account involves two trappers who wintered together somewhere in what's now Michigan. By spring, only one came out. He claimed his partner had died of illness, but The indigenous people who found the cabin later said there were signs of violence, that the body had injuries inconsistent with illness. The surviving trapper was never prosecuted. No witnesses, no evidence beyond what indigenous people reported, and colonial authorities didn't particularly care about violence between trappers in the wilderness. But his reputation was destroyed. No one would partner with him after that. He ended up trapping alone and eventually disappeared. Probably died alone in the wilderness somewhere. The nighttime psychology of that situation haunts me. Two men trapped together all winter, one of them gradually deciding to kill the other, planning it during those long dark hours, waiting for the right moment, and then living alone in that cabin with the body until spring came and he could leave. Did he sleep after killing his partner? Did he spend nights lying awake next to corpse? Or did he drag the body outside and just leave it in the snow? The account doesn't say. Just notes that the body was found in the cabin, so presumably it stayed inside, which means he spent however many weeks or months sharing space with it. That's a level of psychological survival that's hard to even comprehend. Whatever happened in that cabin during those winter nights fundamentally altered that man's mind in ways he couldn't recover from. Let's shift to a different kind of nighttime experience. Indentured servants in various colonies. These were people, mostly from Europe, who'd signed contracts to work for a set period of years in exchange for passage to America. Legally different from slavery, but practically often not that different. Indentured servants had brutal work schedules during the day, dawn to dusk physical labor, but night was supposed to be their own time. Supposed to be. In practice, masters often extended work into nighttime hours or placed restrictions on what servants could do at night. There was a woman in Virginia. We know her as Elizabeth, but no last name survives. She was an indentured servant in the 1650s. Her contract was for 7 years. She'd signed it thinking it was her ticket to a better life. It was not a better life. Elizabeth's master decided that since he was providing her with room and board, he effectively owned her time at night too. He required her to spin thread for hours after the day's work ended. Just sit there by candlelight, exhausted, spinning thread, while the rest of the household slept. This went on for months. Elizabeth was getting maybe 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night. She was constantly exhausted, started making mistakes during the day, which led to punishment, which made everything worse. She tried to run away, got caught. Running away added time to her indenture contract plus punishment. So now she owed more years and was treated even worse. The nights after her failed escape attempt were apparently the worst. Her master was furious that she tried to leave, started checking on her during the night to make sure she wasn't planning another escape. She'd be lying there trying to sleep, and he'd just open her door, stand there staring at her in the darkness, then leave. This psychological torture went on for weeks. Elizabeth never knew when the door would open, never knew if it would just be the staring or if it would escalate to something worse. She stopped sleeping normally, would just lie there all night, tense, waiting for the door. Eventually, Elizabeth did escape successfully. She made it to another colony, changed her name, and disappeared into anonymity. We only know about her story because she testified years later in a court case involving indentured servant rights. She was an old woman by then, and she said she still sometimes woke up at night expecting to see a door opening, someone standing there watching her. That's the thing about nighttime trauma. It sticks with you, creates patterns in your brain that persist long after the actual danger has passed. Elizabeth survived her indenture, built a new life, lived to old age. But those nights, when her master terrorized her, never really ended. They just played on loop in her memory for the rest of her life. Indentured servants often shared sleeping quarters. Multiple people crammed into small spaces, which meant nighttime became this communal experience of misery, but also sometimes solidarity. Servants would talk at night after the masters went to bed, share information, make plans, offer support. These nighttime conversations were where resistance got organized, where servants figured out who could be trusted, where escape plans got made. There was a group of indentured servants in Maryland in the 1660s who organized a revolt. They planned it entirely during nighttime conversations over the course of months, figured out how many of them were willing to participate, what weapons they could access, where they'd go after escaping. The revolt failed. Most revolts did. But the fact that they managed to organize something that complex through whispered nighttime conversations, right under their masters' noses, shows the power of those dark hours. The masters thought they controlled everything. But at night, in the darkness, indentured servants created spaces the masters couldn't fully police. Some of those servants were hanged after the revolt failed. Others had years added to their indentures. But the ones who survived said it was worth it to have tried, worth it to have had that moment of resistance, even if it didn't ultimately free them. There's something profound about that, about people in the most powerless positions finding ways to resist anyway, using the cover of night to plan and hope and dream of freedom, even when freedom seemed impossible. Let's talk about children now, because children experience these nighttime horrors too, and in some ways their experiences were even more traumatic because they didn't have adult frameworks for processing what was happening. In colonial settlements, children as young as 6 or 7 were expected to contribute to nighttime labor, watching fires, minding younger siblings, helping with late-night chores. They didn't get the luxury of childhood as we understand it. There was a boy in Plymouth Colony, we'll call him Thomas, because that was a common name, and his actual name isn't recorded. Thomas was about 8 years old during King Philip's War. His family's homestead got attacked. His parents and older siblings were killed. Thomas survived by hiding in a root cellar. He stayed in that cellar for 3 days and nights, completely silent, completely still, listening to the violence happening above him, listening to his family die, and then listening to the silence after the attackers left. Thomas was eventually found by militia from another settlement. They took him in, but he never really recovered. According to later accounts, he couldn't sleep in darkness for the rest of his life, would become hysterical if someone tried to make him go into a dark room or building. He'd spent those 3 nights in the root cellar in absolute darkness. No light at all, just sounds and smells and his own terror. And his 8-year-old brain had recorded all of it in ways that couldn't be erased. Thomas lived into adulthood, but never married, never had a normal life. He worked as a day laborer, always choosing jobs that kept him outdoors where there was light. He died in his 30s, still afraid of the dark. Children in indigenous communities experienced similar nighttime traumas when their villages were attacked by colonial forces. Raids happened at night. Children woke up to violence and chaos, watched their families die or be taken, had to run into darkness with no idea where they were going or if they'd survive. There's less documentation of these experiences because indigenous oral histories often don't focus on individual trauma narratives in the way European written accounts do. But the trauma was there, was real, was carried forward through generations. One account that does exist comes from a Pequot woman describing her childhood during the Pequot War in the 1630s. She was about 5 years old when English colonists and their Narragansett allies attacked her village at night. She remembered fire and screaming, remembered her mother grabbing her and running, remembered hiding in the forest while the village burned, remembered the smell of smoke and the sounds of people dying. Children of the night, she and her mother survived that night by staying absolutely silent in their hiding spot. The woman described how her mother held a hand over her mouth, not cruelly, but firmly, to make sure she didn't make a sound. They stayed like that for hours. Her jaw ached. She wanted to cry, but couldn't. Her mother's hand stayed there, gentle but unyielding, until the danger passed. That woman said she grew up understanding that silence could save your life. That nighttime was when you had to be most careful, most controlled. She passed that understanding to her own children, taught them how to be quiet in darkness, how to hide, how to survive. That's intergenerational trauma playing out in real time. The nighttime terror of one generation becoming the survival skills of the next, and the next, and the next. Colonial children also learned nighttime survival skills from their trauma, but often in ways that reinforced colonial violence. Children who survived indigenous raids grew up to participate in retaliatory raids. The cycle of nighttime violence perpetuating itself through traumatized children who became traumatized adults who created more traumatized children. Nobody wins in these cycles. Everyone just accumulates more trauma and more reasons to inflict trauma on others. There were some children who tried to break the cycle, tried to process their nighttime terrors in ways that didn't lead to more violence. But colonial society didn't really have space for that. Trauma was expected to make you harder, more willing to fight, more committed to the colonial project. Processing it in healthier ways wasn't really an option. One exception was Quaker communities. Quakers had different ideas about violence and trauma. They created spaces where children could talk about their fears without being told to toughen up or seek revenge. There's a Quaker diary from Pennsylvania, written by a man describing his childhood in the 1680s. He talks about nighttime meeting circles where children and adults would sit together and share their fears, not to plan violence or revenge, just to acknowledge the fear and offer each other comfort. He described feeling held by the community during those nights, like the darkness couldn't fully reach him because he was surrounded by people who cared about his well-being. It didn't erase his trauma, but it gave him tools to live with it. That's rare in these accounts. Most nighttime experiences we're talking about are about isolation and terror. But occasionally, there are these glimpses of community care, of people trying to help each other survive, not just physically, but emotionally. Let's move to a different form of nighttime survival: hospitals and medical care in colonial America. Because getting sick or injured in colonial times was already dangerous, but getting sick or injured at night was often a death sentence. Medical knowledge was limited. Doctors were scarce, especially outside major settlements. And at night, even if you could find a doctor, they often couldn't do much to help you because they couldn't see what they were doing. Surgery by candlelight was a special kind of nightmare. The patient is awake because anesthesia doesn't exist yet. They're being held down by several people. The surgeon is trying to operate with maybe 1 or 2 candles providing light. Shadows are jumping everywhere. Blood looks black in candlelight instead of red, making it hard to see what's bleeding and what isn't. There's an account from a ship's surgeon describing an emergency amputation he had to perform at night during a storm. The ship was pitching in waves. The patient was screaming. The candles kept threatening to go out. He was trying to saw through bone while other sailors held the patient down and held candles close enough to see by, but not so close they'd set something on fire. He described it as the longest hour of his life. The patient survived somehow, but the surgeon said he had nightmares about it for years. The combination of darkness and movement and screaming and blood and just barely being able to see what he was doing. And that was someone with actual medical training. Most people in colonial America didn't have access to trained surgeons. They had local healers, midwives, or just family members doing their best. Childbirth at night was especially dangerous. Labor doesn't wait for daylight. Women went into labor at night all the time. And nighttime births had higher mortality rates for both mothers and babies, partially because the midwives couldn't see as well as they could during the day. There was a midwife in Massachusetts named Martha Ballard who kept detailed diaries of her practice in the late 1700s. She recorded nighttime births as being particularly stressful. She'd have to navigate to wherever the woman was laboring, often through bad weather or difficult terrain, carrying her supplies and trying not to lose or damage anything in the darkness. Then she'd arrive and have to help deliver a baby by firelight or candlelight, judge when to intervene and when to let nature take its course, make split-second decisions about hemorrhaging or breech presentations or cord complications, all while barely being able to see. Martha recorded several nighttime births where she was certain the mother or baby or both were going to die. Sometimes they did die. Sometimes she managed to save them through skill and luck and sheer determination. But every nighttime birth was a gamble in ways that daytime births weren't. She wrote about the emotional toll of this, about arriving home at dawn after a nighttime birth, exhausted, sometimes grieving a loss, and having to immediately start her regular daytime work, about the nightmares she had about births that went wrong, about the constant anxiety when she knew someone in her area was close to their due date, because she knew she might get called out in the middle of the night. Martha did this for decades, hundreds of nighttime births. She survived into her 70s, which was impressive for the time. But her diary entries from her later years mention chronic fatigue and anxiety, mention trouble sleeping, because she's always waiting for someone to knock on her door with news of a woman in labor. The nighttime nature of her work had fundamentally shaped her relationship with darkness and sleep. She couldn't fully relax at night because night meant potential emergencies, meant potential deaths she'd have to witness and try to prevent. That's a different kind of nighttime survival, not surviving an acute trauma, but surviving the chronic stress of knowing that any night could bring crisis, of never being able to truly rest because you're always on call. Doctors and healers weren't the only ones experiencing this. Firefighters, such as they were in colonial times, had the same issue. Fires at night were catastrophic because they were harder to spot early, harder to fight in the dark, and spread faster because people were asleep and didn't notice until it was too late. Colonial towns developed night watch systems partially as fire prevention. Someone had to stay awake to watch for smoke or flames, had to be ready to raise the alarm immediately because minutes could mean the difference between losing one building and losing an entire block. There's an account from Boston describing a night fire in 1679. It started around 2 a.m. in a warehouse. The night watchman spotted it early and raised the alarm. People came running from their homes, mostly still in their night clothes, to form bucket brigades. Fighting a fire in darkness with just buckets of water passed from person to person is basically futile. But they tried anyway because what else could they do? The fire lit the night enough for them to see what they were doing, which was grimly ironic. The thing that was destroying their town was also providing the light to fight it. They lost about a dozen buildings before they got the fire under control. Several people were injured, including some with serious burns. One man died, not from fire, but from a wall collapse while he was trying to save belongings from a burning building. The account describes the aftermath at dawn. People standing in the streets looking at the destruction, still in their night clothes, covered in soot and ash, some crying, some just standing there in shock, the smell of smoke hanging over everything. And then they had to just keep going, had to start rebuilding, had to figure out where the people who'd lost their homes would stay, had to go back to their regular lives, even though they'd just spent the night fighting for their town's survival. That's exhausting to even think about. The whiplash from deep sleep to emergency to tragedy to having to immediately start recovering. No time to process, no time to rest, just survive and move forward. Let's talk about prisons now. Colonial prisons at night. Because if you think prisons are bad now, colonial prisons were nightmares in the most literal sense. Prisons weren't really about rehabilitation. They were about punishment and containment. And at night, prisoners were basically just locked in cells and forgotten until morning. No supervision, no medical care if something went wrong, no intervention if prisoners attacked each other. The cells themselves were dark, maybe a small window that let in moonlight if you were lucky. Maybe not. Just stone walls and darkness, and whoever else was locked in there with you. Prisoners learned to stay awake on their first nights, had to figure out the social dynamics of their cell. Who was dangerous? Who might be an ally? Where the safe spots were if such things existed. All in near complete darkness, relying on sound and touch and instinct. There was a man named John Dane who wrote about spending a night in Boston jail in the 1660s. He'd been arrested for debt, which was a common reason for imprisonment. Described being thrown into a cell with about a dozen other men. The cell was maybe 15 feet by 15 feet. No beds, just a stone floor. The first few hours after dark, the cell was relatively quiet, men trying to sleep or at least rest. But around midnight, a fight broke out. John couldn't see what started it, just heard shouting and then the sounds of violence. Bodies hitting walls, grunting and cursing. Stone and shadow John pressed himself into a corner, trying to stay out of the way. The fight eventually ended. He heard someone groaning in pain, heard labored breathing that suggested broken ribs or worse, and then silence again. Nobody came to check on them. Nobody intervened. The injured man just lay there in the darkness, suffering until morning. When dawn finally came and light filtered into the cell, John saw that the injured man had a gash on his head. Blood dried down the side of his face. 2 of his fingers were bent at wrong angles, obviously broken. He was curled up on the floor, shivering. The guards eventually came and dragged the injured man out. John never found out what happened to him, whether he got medical care or just got thrown into another cell, whether he survived his injuries or died from infection later. The man was just removed from John's awareness, and that was that. John spent 3 more nights in that cell before his debt was settled and he was released. Each night, he pressed himself into his corner and waited for morning, hypervigilant for any signs of another fight or any other danger. He described sleeping maybe an hour or 2 total across those 3 nights. Just couldn't let his guard down enough to actually rest. After he was released, John said he couldn't sleep in darkness for weeks. Would sit up all night with a candle burning. His wife thought he was being ridiculous, wasting expensive candles. But he couldn't explain to her what those nights in prison had done to him. How darkness had become synonymous with danger in ways he couldn't rationally overcome. Eventually, he adjusted, got back to normal sleep patterns. But he said he never fully forgot those nights, never fully let go of the hypervigilance he'd learned in that cell. And John was only in prison for 3 nights, for debt. Imagine people imprisoned for months or years. Imagine murderers or serious criminals who knew they'd eventually be executed, spending every night waiting for morning, wondering if this would be their last day. The psychological toll of that extended nighttime dread. Debtors' prisons in particular were filled with people who weren't violent criminals. They were just poor, couldn't pay their debts, so they got locked up, which of course made it even harder to pay their debts, which meant they stayed locked up longer. A nightmarish cycle with literal nightmares every night they spent in those cells. There's a heartbreaking account from a woman, Elizabeth, imprisoned for debt in Philadelphia in the 1690s. She had 3 children at home. Her husband had died, leaving debts she couldn't pay. So she got imprisoned, and her children were left with neighbors who weren't particularly interested in caring for them long term. Elizabeth spent every night in prison thinking about her children, wondering if they were being fed, if they were safe, if they'd be taken by the authorities and bound out as servants or apprentices. She couldn't sleep, just lay on the stone floor crying quietly, trying not to disturb the other women in the cell. One of those women, an older prisoner, apparently tried to comfort Elizabeth, told her stories to distract her, held her when the crying got too intense. This woman had been in prison for years, also for debt, and had developed her own coping mechanisms, one of which was trying to help other prisoners survive their first weeks. Elizabeth was in prison for about 2 months before someone finally paid her debt and secured her release. She got out and discovered that her children had indeed been bound out as servants. She spent years trying to get them back, trying to buy out their indentures. The historical record doesn't tell us if she succeeded, but those nights in prison, worrying about her children, not knowing what was happening to them, those nights were probably worse than any physical hardship she endured. The psychological torture of not knowing, of being helpless to protect the people she loved. That's a different kind of nighttime survival. Surviving not just physical danger, but emotional and psychological devastation. Finding ways to keep functioning when every instinct is screaming at you to break down. Let's drift to another kind of institutional nighttime experience: almshouses and workhouses. These were institutions for the poor, the disabled, the elderly. People who couldn't support themselves got sent there, and the nighttime conditions were often as bad as prisons, sometimes worse. Almshouses were chronically overcrowded. Too many people, not enough beds, not enough resources. At night, people were crammed into shared sleeping areas, sometimes multiple people to a bed, sometimes just lying on the floor. The sick were mixed in with the healthy, the mentally ill with everyone else, children with adults. No separation, no privacy, no dignity. Just bodies packed into spaces, trying to survive until morning. There was an outbreak of smallpox in a Boston almshouse in 1721. During the day, there were at least some attempts at care. But at night, the sick were just left in their beds with the other residents. No quarantine, no isolation. The disease spread through the almshouse like fire. One account describes the nighttime sounds during the outbreak: people crying in pain, the distinctive cough of smallpox patients, delirious fever dreams spoken aloud, the smell of sickness and waste, and underneath it all, the sound of people praying. Desperate prayers for survival, for relief, for death if survival wasn't possible. The residents who weren't sick yet couldn't leave had nowhere else to go, so they just lay there at night, listening to the sick, knowing they'd probably be next, knowing that when they got sick, they'd become part of the symphony of suffering that kept everyone else awake. About a quarter of the almshouse residents died in that outbreak. The bodies were removed each morning, carted away to mass graves, and the survivors just had to keep living in those same spaces, waiting to see if they'd be on the next cart. The psychological impact of this is hard to overstate. Imagine going to sleep not knowing if you'd wake up with symptoms. Imagine waking up each morning and checking yourself for signs of sickness. Imagine the relief when you were still healthy, immediately followed by guilt about feeling relieved when people around you were dying. Some residents apparently stopped trying to sleep at night during the outbreak, figured they might as well stay awake, pray, prepare themselves mentally for what was likely coming. Sleep felt like a waste of the time they had left. This wasn't unusual. Disease outbreaks in crowded colonial institutions created these nighttime vigils. People staying awake because sleep felt too much like rehearsing death. Because if they fell asleep, they might not wake up. Because consciousness felt like the last thing they could control. Let's talk about mental illness and nighttime in colonial America. Because mental illness wasn't understood the way we understand it now. People exhibiting symptoms of what we'd recognize as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, or other conditions were often labeled as possessed, cursed, or morally deficient. And the treatments, such as they were, often happened at night. Exorcisms, beatings meant to drive out demons or bad spirits, restraints, isolation in dark spaces, all justified as helping the afflicted person, but really just torturing people whose brains worked differently. There's an account from a minister in Connecticut describing attempting to exorcise a young woman in the 1670s. She was probably having a psychotic episode, hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there. But the minister interpreted this as demonic possession. The exorcism happened at night, of course, because night was when demons were supposedly most powerful. The minister gathered other church members in the young woman's home. They tied her to a chair, then spent hours praying over her, shouting at the supposed demons, occasionally striking her to shock the demons into leaving. The young woman was terrified, screaming, begging them to stop. The minister interpreted this as the demons speaking through her, kept the exorcism going through most of the night. Eventually, exhaustion took over. The young woman stopped responding, just sat there in the chair, traumatized into silence. The minister declared the exorcism successful. The demons were gone. The young woman was saved. In reality, he just traumatized a mentally ill young woman so thoroughly that she'd gone into a kind of shutdown. She was never the same afterward, became withdrawn, barely spoke. Eventually was sent to live with distant relatives who kept her locked in an attic room most of the time. That young woman spent the rest of her life, however long that was, reliving that night. The account mentions that she'd have episodes where she'd start screaming about demons and restraints and pain. Her brain had been so damaged by that one night of trauma that she couldn't escape it. And this was considered successful treatment. This was what passed for helping people with mental illness. The nighttime setting added an extra layer of terror to an already terrifying experience. Darkness, candlelight creating jumping shadows, exhaustion and confusion and pain all mixed together into a trauma that couldn't be processed or healed. Families with mentally ill members often had to make impossible decisions about nighttime safety. If someone was having a manic episode or was violently psychotic, they couldn't just be left alone at night. But there were no hospitals, no trained professionals, just family members trying to keep everyone safe. Some families built special rooms, small, windowless spaces where they could lock someone during episodes. The person would be locked in darkness all night, sometimes multiple nights. Sometimes they'd calm down. Sometimes they'd hurt themselves, throwing themselves against walls. One account describes a family in Virginia dealing with a son who had what was probably schizophrenia. During episodes, he'd become convinced that family members were trying to kill him, would become violent trying to defend himself against threats that weren't real. The family built a room for him in their barn. Stone walls, heavy door, no windows. During episodes, they'd lead him there or force him there if necessary. Lock him in, leave him until the episode passed. The son described what those nights were like in a letter he wrote during a lucid period. He knew, on some level, that his family was trying to help. But being locked in darkness, hearing his own breathing and heartbeat, feeling the walls close around him, it was torture. His mind would create things in the darkness, would convince him there were things in the room with him, would make every sound into a threat. He'd eventually calm down enough to be let out, would apologize to his family, would try to be better, but the episodes kept coming. And each time, more nights locked in that dark room, his mind breaking further under the strain. Echoes of madness, that young man eventually died during one of his episodes. The family found him in the morning, dead in his locked room. They never determined exactly what killed him. Could have been a heart attack from stress. Could have been he injured himself and bled out in the darkness. Could have been he simply gave up, his mind and body exhausted beyond the capacity to continue. The family felt guilty, obviously, but they also felt they'd done what they had to do. What else could they have done? There were no other options available to them. They'd tried prayer, tried healers, tried everything their community could suggest. Locking him in darkness was the last resort that became their only resort. That's the tragedy of mental illness in colonial times. Not just the suffering of the afflicted person, but the suffering of families trying to help with no real tools or knowledge. Everyone trapped in nighttime horror together, doing their best and watching it not be enough. Let's talk about religious communities and their nighttime practices. Because not all nighttime experiences were about fear and survival. Some communities developed intentional nighttime spiritual practices that were actually meant to be positive, though they often had their own psychological complications. Monastic communities, the few that existed in colonial America, maintained vigils. Monks or nuns staying awake through the night to pray. This was supposed to be a spiritual discipline, a way of maintaining constant devotion to God. But the reality of staying awake all night, every night, or on a rotating schedule was physically and mentally exhausting. Sleep deprivation does things to the brain, creates hallucinations, reduces impulse control, makes people more susceptible to suggestion and religious ecstasy. There's a fascinating account from a small Catholic community in Maryland in the 1640s. A group of monks maintained nighttime prayer vigils, and several of them started reporting visions during these vigils. Angels, saints, divine messages. The community took these visions seriously at first, thought they were signs of particular holiness. But as the visions became more frequent and more elaborate, some community members started to worry, started to suspect that sleep deprivation was causing hallucinations rather than genuine divine experiences. One monk in particular, Brother Thomas, became known for his elaborate nighttime visions. He'd describe conversations with the Virgin Mary, detailed tour of heaven and hell, prophecies about the community's future. Other monks would stay up with him during his vigils, watching him, and they noted that the visions seemed to come after Brother Thomas had been awake for particularly long periods, that he'd start swaying, his eyes would lose focus, and then he'd begin describing whatever he was seeing. Eventually, the community's leader decided to intervene, ordered Brother Thomas to sleep normal hours for a week. No nighttime vigils, just rest. Brother Thomas protested, said he'd lose his special connection to the divine, said the visions were real and important, but he was ordered to comply. After a week of normal sleep, Brother Thomas's visions stopped completely. He was devastated, felt abandoned by God, fell into a deep depression because he'd based his entire identity on being specially chosen for these divine experiences, and now they were gone. The community had to help him rebuild his sense of purpose and spirituality without the visions, had to help him understand that his worth wasn't dependent on having extraordinary experiences. It took months, and Brother Thomas never fully recovered his previous enthusiasm for religious life. But at least he stopped destroying his health through sleep deprivation. At least he stopped having hallucinations that he couldn't distinguish from reality. Other religious communities took different approaches to nighttime spirituality. Some Puritan communities held midnight prayer meetings, but with everyone attending rather than just individuals staying awake. The communal aspect supposedly made the experience more spiritually meaningful and less likely to induce individual psychological breaks. These midnight meetings had their own intensity. A whole community gathering in darkness, praying together, sometimes for hours. The shared experience created bonds, but also created pressure. You couldn't fall asleep during the meeting, couldn't let your attention wander, had to maintain constant engagement with the prayers and sermons. Some people found this deeply meaningful, felt connected to their community and to God in ways they didn't during daytime services. Others found it exhausting and performative, had to pretend to be engaged when they were really just struggling to stay awake. There was a young man in Massachusetts, probably around 16, who fell asleep during a midnight prayer meeting in 1670. He'd been working hard during the day, was exhausted, and just couldn't keep his eyes open despite his best efforts. The minister saw him sleeping and stopped the meeting to publicly shame him, called him lazy and ungodly, said his sleeping showed disrespect to God and the community, made him stand in front of everyone and apologize. The young man was humiliated. And the thing is, the humiliation didn't make him more devout. It made him resent the church, made him question whether a God who cared about him falling asleep from exhaustion was worth worshiping. He eventually left the community entirely, moved to another colony, stopped attending church regularly. The nighttime public shaming had driven him away from religion rather than toward it. That's the double-edged nature of communal nighttime religious experiences. They could bring people together or push them apart, could deepen faith or destroy it. All depended on how the experiences were handled and what meaning individuals made of them. Some indigenous spiritual practices also involved intentional nighttime experiences. Vision quests often happened at night. Young people, usually around puberty, would go into the wilderness alone, fast, and wait for a vision that would give them spiritual guidance. These weren't comfortable experiences. They were meant to be challenging, meant to push the young person to their limits so they'd be open to spiritual experiences. But they were also frameworks that indigenous cultures had developed over generations. They came with preparation, with community support before and after, with elders who understood what the young person was going through. There's an account from a Jesuit missionary who observed indigenous spiritual practices in New France. He described, with obvious disapproval, young men spending nights alone in the forest waiting for visions. He thought it was superstitious nonsense. But what he described, even through his disapproving lens, was actually a fairly sophisticated understanding of altered states of consciousness. The combination of fasting, isolation, and nighttime darkness created conditions where the brain would generate vivid experiences. The indigenous communities knew this and had developed frameworks for interpreting those experiences in spiritually meaningful ways. The missionary tried to convince some indigenous people to abandon these practices and convert to Christianity. His nighttime prayer vigils, he argued, were superior. The indigenous people he talked to were not convinced. They pointed out that his monks were also using sleep deprivation and isolation to generate spiritual experiences. The main difference was cultural framework, not fundamental practice. The missionary didn't include this in his report back to his superiors, just noted that the indigenous people were stubbornly attached to their superstitions. But his personal diary included the conversation, and it's fascinating to see him grapple with the similarities between what he was doing and what he was condemning. Both practices involved using nighttime and altered states of consciousness to create spiritual meaning. Both involved some level of suffering or discomfort as part of the process. Both could be psychologically damaging if not handled properly, and both could be profoundly meaningful when they worked well. The difference was that the missionaries' culture didn't acknowledge they were doing the same thing, thought their practices were divine truth, while indigenous practices were devilish deception. But functionally, very similar mechanisms with different cultural interpretations. Let's shift gears and talk about something that might seem mundane, but was actually a huge part of nighttime survival: food preservation and storage. Food spoilage didn't stop at night. In fact, some kinds of spoilage accelerated in darkness and cool temperatures. So communities had to develop nighttime practices around food storage that seem obvious now, but were actually complex survival necessities then. Root cellars were dark spaces where food was stored. Vegetables, preserved meats, grains, and those root cellars needed to be checked regularly, including at night, because rodents and other pests were primarily nocturnal. There was a perpetual nighttime war happening in every colonial settlement. Humans versus rats, mice, weasels, and other creatures that wanted the stored food. Losing that war meant starvation. So someone had to maintain vigilance. Families would rotate who stayed up to check the food storage. You'd go down into the dark root cellar with a candle or lamp, checking for signs of intrusion, looking for droppings, gnaw marks, disturbed containers, setting or checking traps. This sounds straightforward, but root cellars were terrifying places at night. Dark, confined, full of shadows. Strange sounds as the house settled or wind blew through cracks. And you never knew what you might find down there. Sometimes just evidence of pests. Sometimes actual animals that would attack if cornered. Sometimes snakes that had found their way in looking for the rodents. One woman in Pennsylvania described going down to a root cellar one night and disturbing a raccoon that had broken in. The raccoon, cornered and afraid, attacked her. She ended up with severe lacerations on her arms and hands, nearly lost a finger. And this happened in darkness with just her candle for light. She survived, but the infection from the wounds nearly killed her. And she never felt safe going into the root cellar again. Would send her older children instead, which wasn't fair to them, but was the only way she could keep the family fed without having panic attacks. That's a level of daily nighttime danger that we don't think about anymore. The possibility that checking your food storage could result in serious injury or death. The psychological toll of having to do it anyway, because the alternative was letting your family's food supply get destroyed. Some communities developed communal food storage systems, partially to share the burden of nighttime protection. Multiple families storing food in one larger space that could be better secured and monitored. They'd rotate guard duty so no one family bore the entire burden. But communal storage created its own nighttime tensions, trust issues. If food went missing, who was responsible? If someone on guard duty fell asleep and pests got in, how should they be punished? Small communities could fracture over these questions. There's a record of a community in Rhode Island that split apart in the 1650s, partially over disputes about communal food storage. Someone had fallen asleep on guard duty. A significant amount of stored grain got contaminated by rodents, and the community couldn't agree on who should bear the loss. Some families blamed the person who'd been on guard, said they should have to compensate everyone else for the lost food. That family argued it was an accident, that anyone could fall asleep after working hard all day, that the risk should be shared by everyone. The weight of watchfulness, the dispute escalated, became about more than just food, became about trust and responsibility, and whether the community could actually function as a community. Eventually, several families left to establish their own settlement elsewhere. The remaining families continued with their communal storage, but with stricter rules and harsher penalties for anyone who failed their guard duty. The nighttime tension of those guard shifts must have been intense after that split. Everyone knowing that falling asleep could destroy your reputation and your standing in the community, could result in financial penalties you couldn't afford, could get you and your family expelled. So you stayed awake, fought against every instinct to rest, drank water, moved around, pinched yourself, whatever it took. And in the morning, you were exhausted, but at least you'd fulfilled your duty. At least you hadn't failed the community. That exhaustion accumulated. People on rotating guard duty were chronically sleep-deprived, made mistakes during daytime work, had shortened tempers, got sick more easily. The nighttime vigilance required for survival was slowly destroying health and well-being in other ways. Some communities recognized this and tried to adjust their systems. Shorter guard shifts, more people rotating through so no individual bore too much burden. But there were only so many adjustments possible. The work still needed to be done. The food still needed to be protected. And night still came every day, whether you were ready for it or not. Let's talk about craftspeople and artisans who worked at night, because some trades required nighttime work for various reasons, and those workers developed their own survival strategies. Bakers, for instance, often worked through the night. Bread needed to be fresh for morning markets, so bakers would start their work in the middle of the night, preparing dough, tending ovens, timing everything so bread would be ready at dawn. The work was hot and exhausting. Bakeries in colonial times were small operations, usually attached to the baker's home. The heat from the ovens was intense. In summer, working through the night at least meant you weren't dealing with daytime heat on top of oven heat. In winter, the ovens provided warmth, but also created stark temperature contrasts between the work area and the rest of the space. But the real challenge was the isolation and exhaustion. You're working alone, or with maybe one apprentice. Everyone else is asleep. You're tired but have to stay alert because baking requires precision. Misjudge the timing and you waste expensive flour and fuel. Fall asleep and you could burn down the building. There was a baker in New York, we'll call him Willem, who kept a journal in the 1690s. He wrote about the psychological challenge of nighttime baking, the loneliness, the way time seemed to stretch out in the darkness, the constant fight against sleep. Willem described developing little rituals to stay awake, songs he'd sing to himself, mental games calculating quantities and costs. Sometimes he'd talk to himself, full conversations with an imaginary companion just to hear a human voice. He was worried he was going insane. The isolation and sleep deprivation were making him question his own thoughts. But he couldn't stop. Baking was his livelihood. His family depended on the income. So he kept working through the nights, kept fighting his deteriorating mental state, kept pretending everything was fine during the day. Eventually, Willem took on an apprentice, partially just to have company during the night shifts. The apprentice was young, maybe 13, and not particularly skilled. But having another person there, someone to talk to, someone to help stay awake, made the nighttime work bearable again. The apprentice had his own adjustment period. Going from normal sleep schedules to working through the night was difficult. He'd fall asleep standing up, would make mistakes from exhaustion. Willem was patient with him, remembered his own early struggles with nighttime work. After a few months, the apprentice adapted, learned to sleep during the day, developed his own strategies for staying alert at night, and Willem's mental state improved dramatically with the companionship. The journal entries from after the apprentice arrived are noticeably more stable and optimistic. That's the power of companionship in nighttime survival. Having someone else there transforms the experience. The darkness is less oppressive. The time moves faster. The work is still hard, but becomes manageable. Other craftspeople who worked at night included watchmen, night soil collectors, and occasionally blacksmiths who'd work through the night to complete urgent repairs. Each developed their own subculture around nighttime work, their own songs and stories and strategies for coping. Night soil collectors had possibly the worst job. They collected human waste from privies and cesspits, usually at night, so the smell wouldn't bother people during the day. It was disgusting, dangerous work. People who did it were often social outcasts, avoided during the day even when they weren't actively working. But they formed their own tight-knit communities, looked out for each other, shared knowledge about which households paid better or treated them more respectfully, developed efficient routes and techniques for their work. There's very little written record of these workers' nighttime experiences because they were mostly illiterate and were considered too low class for their perspectives to matter. But we know they existed. No, they worked through countless nights doing essential work that everyone else wanted to pretend didn't happen. The few accounts we have come from city records or complaints from people who lived near where night soil was dumped. Those accounts describe the nighttime sounds and smells of this work. The creaking of carts, the voices of workers calling to each other, the overwhelming stench that would drift through neighborhoods after midnight. Residents complained constantly, wanted the work done somewhere else, somehow else, anywhere that didn't affect them. But the work had to be done. Cities produce waste. That waste had to go somewhere. And doing it at night, at least, kept it partially out of sight and mind. The night soil collectors knew they were despised, knew their work was considered degrading, but they also knew it was necessary. And some accounts suggest they took pride in that necessity. Pride in doing work that others couldn't or wouldn't do, in surviving nighttime conditions that would have broken other people. That's a different kind of nighttime survival, surviving not just physical challenges, but social stigma. finding meaning and community in work that society scorned. Let's talk about lighthouse keepers. Colonial America didn't have many lighthouses yet, but the few that existed were staffed by keepers who had some of the most isolated nighttime experiences imaginable. A lighthouse keeper's primary job was maintaining the light through the night, keeping it burning, keeping it visible, ensuring ships could navigate safely. This meant staying awake most or all night, every night, often alone. The first lighthouse in colonial America was Boston Light, established in 1716. The keeper there lived in the lighthouse with his family, but the actual work of maintaining the light was his alone. There's a journal from an early Boston Light keeper describing the nighttime routine. Climbing the stairs to check the light every couple hours, trimming wicks, adding oil, cleaning the lantern glass, making sure the light stayed bright and visible. Between these checks, he had hours of darkness and solitude. He'd try to sleep, but couldn't fully rest because he was always listening for weather changes, always aware that he needed to check the light again soon. His sleep became fragmented, never deep, always partially alert. The keeper described the psychological effects of this routine: the constant exhaustion, the way isolation made his thoughts circular and obsessive, the weather obsession that developed because weather determined how dangerous the night would be for ships. On stormy nights, he couldn't sleep at all, would spend the entire night maintaining the light, watching for ships in distress, ready to help if rescue was possible. The wind would howl around the lighthouse. Waves would crash against the rocks below, and he'd be up there alone with his light, the only thing between ships and disaster. He described seeing ships founder in storms, watching from the lighthouse as vessels broke apart on rocks or capsized in heavy seas. Being able to see the disaster, but unable to do anything to prevent or help with it. Just witnessing death from his isolated tower and having to live with those memories. After particularly bad storms, debris and sometimes bodies would wash up on the rocks around the lighthouse. The keeper would have to deal with this, report it to authorities, sometimes help with recovery efforts, and then go back to his normal routine, pretending the nighttime horrors he'd witnessed weren't affecting him. His wife worried about him. The journal includes notes about conversations where she expressed concern about his mental state. He'd become withdrawn, quieter, would sit staring at the ocean for hours during his off time. She wanted him to find different work, but lighthouse keeper positions were relatively stable and paid decently. They couldn't afford for him to quit, so he kept doing it, kept climbing those stairs every night, kept maintaining the light, kept witnessing maritime disasters and trying to process them alone. Eventually, he trained his oldest son to help with the work, partially because he needed the help, and partially because he needed the company. The son's presence helped, made the nighttime duties more manageable. But it also meant the son started experiencing the same psychological toll, started having the same fragmented sleep, the same weather obsession, the same nighttime memories that wouldn't fade. 2 generations of nighttime trauma in one family, all from doing a job that was absolutely necessary for maritime safety, but absolutely brutal on the people who did it. Other lighthouse keepers had similar experiences. The isolation, the responsibility, the constant nighttime vigilance, the psychological weight of knowing that your attention or lack thereof could mean life or death for people you'd never meet. Some keepers developed superstitions and rituals to cope, would only trim the wicks in a certain order, would sing specific songs while climbing the stairs, would perform little ceremonies before lighting the lamp each evening. These rituals provided structure and meaning, helped manage the anxiety of the responsibility. One keeper in Rhode Island became convinced the lighthouse was haunted. He'd hear footsteps on the stairs when no one else was there, hear doors opening and closing, see shadows moving in ways that didn't match any physical source. Probably these were just auditory and visual hallucinations from sleep deprivation and isolation. But the keeper interpreted them as ghosts of sailors who died in shipwrecks. He started talking to these ghosts, would have conversations with empty air while making his rounds. His family thought he was losing his mind. Maybe he was, but the conversations seemed to help him, gave him company during the long nights, made the isolation less absolute. If he was going to hallucinate anyway, might as well make the hallucinations friendly. Spirits and silence. The keeper's wife eventually reported his behavior to the lighthouse authority. She was worried he wasn't fit for the job anymore. But when inspectors came to evaluate him, they found the lighthouse in perfect condition. The light was well maintained. Records were accurate. The keeper performed all his duties flawlessly despite his supposed mental decline. They decided to let him continue. Figured if talking to ghosts was how he coped with the isolation, and if he was still doing the job properly, then it wasn't their problem. So he kept his position, kept having his nighttime conversations with shadows and echoes, kept the light burning for ships that passed in darkness, never knowing the keeper watching over them was slowly unraveling under the weight of his solitary vigil. Let's drift to yet another form of nighttime experience. Traveling after dark, because people did have to travel sometimes, even at night, and colonial roads were dangerous in ways that go beyond what we usually think about. Roads were barely roads, often just cleared paths through forest or wilderness. No lighting, no signage. Easy to get lost even if you'd traveled the route before. And at night, navigation became almost impossible unless you had a full moon and clear skies. But sometimes travel couldn't wait for daylight. Medical emergencies, messages that needed delivering urgently, people trying to reach safety before weather worsened. So they'd travel at night and deal with the consequences. There was a man named Samuel who had to ride through the night from Boston to Plymouth in 1665. His daughter was seriously ill in Plymouth, and he'd received word that she might not survive. He left Boston at sunset and rode through the darkness, desperate to reach her before she died. The route took him through about 40 miles of mostly wilderness. Some stretches had houses or settlements where he could orient himself. Others were just forest and darkness. His horse knew the route, which helped. horses can get spooked at night, can stumble on uneven ground you can't see. Samuel described this journey in a letter to his brother. He wrote about the terror of not being able to see more than a few feet ahead, even with his lantern, about hearing animals in the darkness around him, about his horse shying at shadows and nearly throwing him multiple times. At one point, the horse refused to go forward, just stopped and wouldn't move despite Samuel's urging. He sat there in the darkness, frustrated and frightened, trying to figure out what was wrong. Eventually, he climbed down and felt his way forward on foot. There was a fallen tree across the path. His horse had sensed it in the darkness and stopped. If they'd continued at speed, both Samuel and the horse could have been seriously injured. So he had to lead the horse around the obstacle, feeling his way in darkness before he could remount and continue. The journey took him most of the night. He arrived in Plymouth at dawn, exhausted and terrified, only to learn that his daughter had died a few hours before he arrived. He'd ridden through the night, risked his life, and still hadn't made it in time. Samuel wrote that he sat with his daughter's body for hours, too numb to cry, too exhausted to process what had happened. The nighttime journey and the grief blurred together into one continuous trauma that he said never fully left him. That's the cruel mathematics of nighttime travel, the urgency that makes it necessary, the danger that makes it terrible, and often the futility when you arrive too late anyway. Other nighttime travelers faced different challenges. Bandits and thieves knew that people traveling at night were often carrying something valuable or urgent. Why else risk nighttime travel? So they'd set ambushes on commonly traveled routes. There are accounts of travelers being robbed at night, left injured or dead on dark roads. The bodies sometimes weren't found for days. Animals would get to them. Weather would deteriorate evidence. Justice was rare because there were no witnesses, no way to track criminals in darkness. Some travelers formed groups for nighttime journeys. Safety in numbers. But groups traveled slower, were easier to hear coming, and if they did encounter bandits, the violence could be worse because there were more people to rob and more potential for resistance. There's an account of a group of 5 men traveling at night from Philadelphia to Wilmington in 1695. They were ambushed by 3 bandits. One traveler was killed immediately. The others fought back, managed to kill one bandit, and drive off the other 2. But they were now stuck on a dark road with 2 dead bodies, injured, not sure if the bandits would return with reinforcements. They spent the rest of the night hiding in the forest near the road, too afraid to continue traveling, too afraid to stay where they were, just huddled together in darkness, listening to every sound, waiting for dawn. When morning came, they left the bodies and continued to Wilmington, reported the incident to authorities. But the surviving bandits were never caught. The dead traveler's family never got justice, just had to live with the knowledge that he'd been killed on a dark road and his killers were still out there somewhere. The survivors of that ambush were traumatized. One of them never traveled at night again for the rest of his life, would simply refuse, would sleep wherever he was rather than travel in darkness. The nighttime ambush had permanently altered his sense of safety. Weather added another layer of danger to nighttime travel. Rain made roads muddy and treacherous. Snow obscured paths entirely. Fog could make you completely lose your bearings, and you couldn't just stop and wait for better conditions if you were already in transit. You had to keep going and hope you didn't die. There's a harrowing account from a woman named Abigail who was traveling with her husband and 2 children from their farmstead to a town about 15 miles away in New York in 1678. They left in late afternoon, expecting to arrive before full darkness. But a storm came in faster than they anticipated. By the time they were halfway to town, it was fully dark and snowing heavily. The road disappeared under snow. Their horse was struggling. The children were crying from cold, and they had to make a decision: try to continue to town or try to find shelter. They tried to continue, got lost within a mile. The horse stumbled into a ditch they couldn't see in the darkness and snow. The horse broke its leg. They had to put it down, which meant they were now on foot with 2 small children in a snowstorm at night, with no idea where they were. Abigail's husband tried to build a shelter using branches and their horse blankets. They huddled together under this makeshift cover while snow piled up around them. The night was endless. The children stopped crying eventually, just shivered and whimpered. Abigail and her husband took turns holding the children against their bodies, sharing warmth, trying to keep everyone alive until morning. They survived. A search party found them the next day, half buried in snow, but alive. But they lost several toes to frostbite. The children both got pneumonia and took months to recover. And the family never attempted to travel more than a couple miles from home again. The nighttime blizzard had broken something in their willingness to take risks. Abigail wrote about that night years later, described the darkness and cold as almost physical presences, said she'd felt like they were being slowly erased from existence, like the night and snow were consuming them, and in the morning there'd be nothing left. The fact that they survived felt like a miracle she never fully understood or trusted. That sense of the night as an active threat, not just an absence of light, but a presence trying to harm you, shows up repeatedly in accounts of nighttime survival. The darkness becomes personified, becomes something with intention and malice. Probably this is just how traumatized human brains process things that are too large and abstract to fully comprehend. Easier to imagine darkness as an enemy than to accept the randomness and indifference of nature. But the result is the same. People who survive nighttime ordeals often develop this sense that night itself is dangerous, not just the things that happen to occur at night. Let's talk about one more category of nighttime experience before we start wrapping this up: natural disasters at night. Because earthquakes, hurricanes, fires, and floods don't wait for convenient timing. And when they hit at night, the chaos and death toll were often much worse than daytime disasters. The 1638 earthquake in New England happened at night. It was strong enough to wake people throughout the region. Buildings shook, chimneys collapsed, and people had no idea what was happening because most of them had never experienced an earthquake before. There are accounts of people running out of their houses in night clothes, barefoot, into winter cold, because they thought the world was ending. Some fell and injured themselves in the darkness. Some huddled together in groups, praying, convinced the apocalypse had arrived. The earthquake only lasted about 30 seconds, but the psychological impact lasted much longer. People were too afraid to go back inside their houses that night, spent the rest of the darkness outside, freezing, waiting to see if the shaking would return. In the following weeks, people reported not being able to sleep inside buildings, would spend nights outside or in makeshift shelters, even though it was winter. The feeling of the earth moving beneath them, the sound of buildings creaking and cracking in darkness, had created a trauma response that rational knowledge couldn't override. Eventually, most people adjusted, went back to sleeping indoors, but some never fully recovered that sense of safety, would startle awake at any unusual sound, would keep emergency supplies near their beds, just in case. The nighttime earthquake had taught them that disaster could strike without warning, and they couldn't unlearn that lesson. Hurricanes in coastal areas were similarly devastating when they hit at night. The 1635 hurricane that struck New England came ashore in the evening. People went to bed thinking it was just a bad storm, woke up to catastrophic winds and flooding. Houses were destroyed while families slept. People drowned in their beds as storm surge flooded coastal areas. Others were killed by debris flying through the darkness. And rescue efforts were nearly impossible because you couldn't see, couldn't navigate, couldn't determine where help was most needed. When dawn brings only reckoning survivors described the nighttime hurricane as the most terrifying experience of their lives. The sound alone was overwhelming. Wind howling like nothing they'd heard before. Rain so heavy it sounded like standing under a waterfall. The crashes of trees falling and buildings collapsing. And all of this in complete darkness, unable to see what was happening or where safety might be. One family survived by climbing onto their roof as their house flooded. They spent the entire night clinging to the roof in hurricane force winds and rain, not knowing if the structure would hold. The parents tied their children to the chimney with rope to keep them from being blown away. The children screamed in terror for hours until exhaustion silenced them. By morning, the hurricane had passed. The family was still alive, still on their roof, but their house was destroyed. The surrounding area was unrecognizable. Trees were gone. Other houses were gone. Bodies of neighbors and animals were scattered across the landscape. They'd survived the nighttime terror only to face the daylight horror of seeing what they'd lost. The father later said he didn't know which was worse, the night of not knowing what was happening, or the morning of seeing exactly what had happened. That family, like many hurricane survivors, struggled for years afterward with nighttime anxiety. Every storm that came after dark would trigger memories of the hurricane. The sound of rain on the roof would cause panic attacks. Sleep became difficult because their minds associated darkness with disaster. Some survivors moved inland, away from coasts, trying to escape the memories and the risk. But you can't fully escape trauma. It travels with you, recreates itself in new contexts. The nighttime hurricane had marked them permanently. Fire at night was particularly deadly in colonial settlements. Buildings were wood and packed close together. Fire spread fast, and at night, by the time people woke up and realized what was happening, it was often too late. The 1653 fire in Boston started around midnight. Started in a warehouse, spread to neighboring buildings before anyone noticed. By the time the alarm was raised, multiple structures were engulfed. People woke to smoke and heat, tried to escape in darkness and confusion. Some made it out, some didn't. Exact death tolls from nighttime fires are often uncertain because bodies were burned beyond recognition or were never found at all. Survivors described the nighttime fire as like being in hell. The light from the flames was bright but disorienting, created harsh shadows, made it hard to see through smoke. The heat was intense. The sound was deafening. And everywhere people were screaming, trying to save themselves or their belongings or their loved ones. One woman escaped a burning building carrying her infant, got outside and realized her two older children were still inside. She tried to go back, but the smoke and heat drove her back. She stood in the street screaming her children's names while the building burned. Her children died. She had to live with that, had to live with the choice to save one child and the inability to save the others. That woman was never the same afterward, developed severe depression, would wake up at night screaming her dead children's names. Eventually took her own life. The nighttime fire had killed her as surely as it killed her children, just more slowly. These stories of natural disasters at night all share common themes. The disorientation of waking to crisis, the inability to see what's happening or respond effectively, the way darkness amplifies fear and makes everything worse, and the lasting trauma that survivors carry forward, the way those nighttime hours of terror echo through the rest of their lives. As we start moving toward the end of this long nighttime journey through colonial American history, let's take a moment to reflect on what all these stories tell us about human survival. The people we've been talking about faced nighttime horrors that most of us can barely imagine. Starvation in a locked fort, chains in a slave ship hold, privy raids and witch accusations, storms and earthquakes and fires. The constant vigilance required just to survive until morning. And yet, they did survive. Not all of them, obviously. Many died, but enough survived to continue. To have children who had children who eventually became us. The survival strategies varied. Some people used silence, became so quiet in darkness that danger passed them by. Others used community, finding safety in numbers and shared experience. Some used physical skills, learning to navigate and work in conditions that would have killed others. Some used mental discipline, maintaining focus and sanity through routines and rituals. But underneath all these strategies was a fundamental human resilience, an ability to endure more than seems possible, to keep going even when every instinct screams to give up, to find meaning and purpose even in the darkest moments. The nighttime experiences we've explored weren't ennobling or character building in some simple moral sense. Trauma is trauma, it damages people. Many of the survivors we've discussed were permanently marked by their nighttime ordeals, carried psychological and physical scars for the rest of their lives. But they also carried something else, a knowledge that they'd survived, that they'd faced the darkness and made it through to morning. That knowledge didn't erase the trauma, but it coexisted with it, provided a foundation for continuing. There's this tendency in modern culture to romanticize historical suffering, to imagine that people in the past were somehow tougher or more resilient than we are. That's not quite right. They were just people, ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with whatever tools and resources they had available. Many of them would have broken under less pressure if they'd had that option. Many of them were breaking even as they survived, developing what we now recognize as PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders. But they didn't have the vocabulary or frameworks to understand what was happening to them. Didn't have mental health treatment, just had to keep functioning and hope they could hold themselves together. That's not admirable in some heroic sense. It's just sad. A commentary on the brutality of colonial life and the lack of support systems for traumatized people. But within that sadness, there are also moments of genuine human connection and care. The maroon woman who carried a crying child while teaching escape routes. The older prisoner who comforted the younger one grieving her children. The Wampanoag women who taught Mary Rowlandson survival skills. The baker who took on an apprentice, partly just for nighttime company. These moments don't erase the larger horrors. Don't make the nighttime ordeals somehow worthwhile or meaningful. But they do show that even in the worst circumstances, humans reach for each other. Try to ease each other's suffering. Create bonds that make survival slightly more bearable. That capacity for connection in darkness is maybe the most hopeful thing we can take from these stories. Not that suffering builds character or that trauma makes you stronger, but that humans, even when they're terrified and exhausted and broken, still try to help each other, still recognize each other's humanity and respond to it. The nighttime silences we've explored were often silences of fear and oppression. People staying quiet because making noise meant death. Within those silences, whispered conversations happened. Plans were made. Support was offered. The silence wasn't absolute even when it seemed to be. And the survival we've been talking about wasn't just physical. It was psychological, emotional, spiritual. People finding ways to maintain some sense of self, even when everything was trying to destroy that self. Keeping memories alive. Maintaining cultural practices in secret. Teaching children how to survive, while also teaching them how to be human. That's harder than just surviving physically. It's one thing to make it through a terrible night. It's another to make it through that night without losing everything that makes you who you are. Many people did lose themselves. The trauma was too much. They survived physically, but something essential died. We've seen examples of that throughout these stories. The woman in Jamestown who never slept again. The young man locked in darkness who eventually died in that locked room. The mother who lost her children in a fire and eventually took her own life. Survival isn't always a victory. Sometimes it's just prolonged suffering, but other people managed to hold onto something, found ways to integrate their trauma and continue living lives that had meaning and connection, passed on not just their trauma, but also their strength, their knowledge, their stubborn insistence on continuing despite everything. The indigenous peoples we've discussed survived not just individual nighttime ordeals, but centuries of colonial violence and oppression. Many of their cultural practices and knowledge systems survived too. Not unchanged, because nothing survives unchanged, but survived in forms that could be adapted and passed forward. The enslaved people who resisted in darkness, who used nighttime for planning and connection, who maintained their humanity in conditions designed to destroy it. Their descendants inherited that resistance, that refusal to be fully broken by oppression. The colonists who survived nighttime terrors and built communities, however flawed, who developed systems and practices that allowed survival in harsh environments. Their knowledge got passed down too. All of these nighttime survival stories are part of the foundation of American history. They don't get taught in schools, don't get commemorated with monuments, don't fit neatly into narratives about founding fathers and manifest destiny and the march of progress. But they're real. They happened. And the people who lived through them deserve to be remembered not as abstract historical figures, but as actual humans who suffered and survived, and sometimes even found moments of grace in the darkness. As we come to the end of this marathon journey through nighttime colonial America, maybe the main thing to take away is this: darkness is different when you can't turn on a light. When night means genuine danger and genuine isolation. When survival requires constant vigilance and strategies we don't need anymore. We're lucky to live in a time when night is mostly just an inconvenience. When darkness means flipping a switch. When the horrors that happen after sunset are mostly metaphorical rather than literal. But it's worth remembering that for most of human history, that wasn't the case. Night was dangerous, was something to survive. And the people who survived it, who made it through to morning again and again, those people built the world we inherited. Their nighttime survival strategies, their resilience, their moments of connection and care in darkness, all of that is woven into the fabric of who we are now. We carry forward their strengths and their traumas, their knowledge and their fears, their determination to continue despite everything telling them to give up. So as you lie in bed tonight, in the safety of your lit room with locks on your doors and emergency services a phone call away, maybe spare a thought for all the people who survived nights when none of those things existed, who lay in darkness wondering if they'd see morning, who found ways to keep going anyway. Their nights are over now, but their stories remain, whispered through centuries, passed from one generation to the next, reminding us that survival is possible even when it seems impossible, that humans can endure extraordinary suffering and still maintain their humanity. That darkness, no matter how complete it seems, eventually gives way to dawn. Let's talk about one final category of nighttime experience before we truly close: the nights after survival. Because because making it through a traumatic night doesn't mean the ordeal is over. The psychological aftermath often lasted much longer than the event itself. We've touched on this throughout, but it's worth exploring more directly. What happened to people's relationship with nighttime after they'd survived something terrible in darkness? Many developed chronic insomnia. Their brains had learned that night equals danger. Even when they were objectively safe, even years after the traumatic event, their bodies and minds couldn't fully relax after dark. Sleep became this battleground where survival instincts fought against the physical need for rest. There was a man named Joseph who survived a nighttime indigenous raid on his Massachusetts settlement in 1676. He was 17 at the time. The raid killed his parents and siblings. Joseph escaped by hiding in a well, submerged up to his neck in freezing water for hours while the raid happened above him. He survived, was pulled from the well the next morning, nearly dead from hypothermia, but alive. Physically, he recovered. Psychologically, he never fully did. Joseph lived another 40-some years after that night, got married, had children, worked as a farmer. By external measures, he built a normal life. But his wife's diary mentions that he never slept normally, would lie awake most nights, would get up and walk around the house checking doors and windows over and over, would startle awake at any sound. His children grew up thinking this was normal, thought all fathers prowled the house at night, hypervigilant for threats. It wasn't until they were adults and had their own households that they realized their father's behavior was unusual, was a response to trauma he'd never processed or healed from. Joseph never talked about the night in the well. His wife knew the basic facts, but not the details. His children knew something bad had happened to him as a young man, but didn't know what. The trauma was this silent presence in the family, shaping everything, but never directly acknowledged. That pattern repeats across many of these nighttime survival stories. The survivors often didn't or couldn't talk about what they'd experienced, partly because there was no therapeutic framework for processing trauma, partly because talking about it meant reliving it, partly because colonial culture valued stoicism and moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. So people carried their nighttime horrors silently, let them shape their behaviors and choices without ever fully examining them, passed them on to the next generation in subtle ways. The children of traumatized parents learned to be hypervigilant too, learned that night was dangerous even if they didn't know why they'd learned that. Intergenerational trauma is a concept we understand better now. The way trauma gets passed down not just through stories, but through behaviors, through what parents teach their children about safety and danger, through physiological changes that can actually affect gene expression. The people we've been talking about didn't have that framework, but they were living it anyway. The nighttime traumas of one generation becoming the nighttime anxieties of the next, the survival strategies that had been necessary becoming habits, and then traditions that persisted long after the original threats had faded. Some people found ways to reclaim night after trauma, developed new associations and experiences that slowly overwrote the traumatic ones. But this took time and often required conscious effort that most people didn't have the resources or knowledge to undertake. There's an account of a woman named Rebecca who'd been held captive during King Philip's War. She'd spent weeks living with an indigenous community, experiencing things that terrified her before being released in a prisoner exchange. Rebecca was traumatized by the experience, particularly by the nights she'd spent during captivity. She couldn't sleep in darkness afterward, would keep candles burning all night despite the expense and fire risk. But Rebecca decided, years after her captivity ended, that she was tired of being afraid, tired of letting her trauma control her relationship with nighttime. So she started taking deliberate walks at night, just around her property at first, then gradually venturing farther. It terrified her initially, but she kept doing it, night after night, slowly teaching her brain that darkness didn't automatically mean danger, that she could be outside at night and nothing terrible would happen. It took months, maybe years, but eventually, Rebecca's nighttime walks became something she enjoyed. She'd write in her diary about the peace of night, the stars, the quiet. She'd reclaimed darkness from her trauma. Not everyone could do this. Rebecca had resources and support that many trauma survivors didn't have, had the time and safety to work on healing. But her story shows that recovery was possible, at least sometimes, even without modern therapeutic frameworks. Other survivors found healing through community, through connecting with other people who'd survived similar nighttime ordeals, sharing experiences, even if they didn't have the language of therapy or trauma processing. Just acknowledging to each other that the nights were hard, that they understood, that they weren't alone. There are records of survivor communities forming after major disasters, after the big fires or storms or raids. People who'd lived through the same nighttime horror staying connected afterward, meeting regularly, supporting each other through difficult anniversaries or when nighttime anxiety became overwhelming. These informal support networks did what modern therapy tries to do: created space for survivors to process their experiences, validated their struggles, provided community and connection that made individual pain more bearable. Colonial society didn't necessarily value this kind of mutual support. The official stance was often that people should just get over it, move on, be strong. But people created these support systems anyway, because they needed them to survive not just the traumatic event, but the aftermath. That's another form of nighttime survival, surviving the endless nights after the terrible night, finding ways to keep going when your brain is constantly replaying trauma, when every sunset brings anxiety about what darkness might bring. The children who grew up in traumatized households, who learned their parents' hypervigilance and fear, often had complicated relationships with nighttime too. Some rebelled against it, deliberately taking risks at night to prove they weren't afraid. Others internalized it completely, becoming even more cautious and fearful than their parents. There's a fascinating account of a family in Pennsylvania. 3 generations documented through letters and diaries. The grandfather survived a nighttime attack in the 1670s, developed severe nighttime anxiety that shaped his entire household. His children grew up in that environment, learned to be cautious at night, learned that darkness was dangerous. And when they had children of their own, they passed on those same messages, even though they personally had never experienced the original trauma. By the 3rd generation, the great-grandchildren were exhibiting nighttime anxiety without any direct connection to the original traumatic event. They just knew, on some deep level that had been taught and reinforced throughout their childhood, that night was a time to be careful, to be vigilant, to be afraid. But interestingly, that 3rd generation also started questioning it, started asking why they were afraid, what the family stories were, and in learning about their grandfather's trauma, they began to understand their own behaviors differently. One great-granddaughter wrote in her diary about realizing that her nighttime fears weren't really hers. They were inherited, and that realization gave her some freedom to examine the fears and decide which ones were actually useful and which ones were just echoes of someone else's trauma. She didn't completely overcome the nighttime anxiety, but she developed a different relationship with it, understood where it came from, could observe it rather than being completely controlled by it. That's maybe the best outcome we can hope for with intergenerational trauma. Not that it gets completely erased, but that future generations can understand it and make conscious choices about how much power to give it. As we near the true end of this exploration, let's return to where we started. The idea of nighttime as a space of survival and silence. Throughout all these stories, silence has been a recurring theme. The forced silence of people hiding from danger. The chosen silence of people planning resistance. The traumatized silence of survivors who couldn't or wouldn't speak about what they'd experienced. But silence isn't absence. It's its own kind of presence. The silences we've explored were full of meaning, full of human experience that couldn't be put into words, but was no less real for that. The enslaved people whispering in darkness, planning revolts. That silence contained revolution. The indigenous runners moving through night, carrying knotted cords. That silence contained coordination and resistance. The woman sitting in Jamestown with her knife, waiting for dawn. That silence contained determination and survival. The prisoners lying in darkness, listening to each other's suffering. That silence contained solidarity and witness. All of these silences were acts of agency in circumstances designed to eliminate agency, ways of maintaining humanity and purpose when everything was trying to strip those away. And the survival we've been examining wasn't passive, wasn't just enduring until the danger passed. It was active, strategic, creative. People adapted to nighttime dangers in ways that showed remarkable ingenuity. They developed navigation techniques using stars and memorized landmarks, created communication systems that worked in darkness, built social structures and support networks that helped distribute the burden of nighttime vigilance, found moments of beauty and connection even in the most terrifying circumstances. The Maroon communities teaching nighttime forest navigation. The night soil collectors developing efficient routes and mutual aid. The bakers creating rituals and finding companionship. The lighthouse keepers maintaining their lights despite crushing isolation. All of these were acts of creative survival. They took impossible situations and found ways to make them slightly more possible. Took darkness that was meant to destroy them and found ways to exist within it. Not comfortably, not without cost, but they found ways. And in finding those ways, they created knowledge that got passed forward. Skills and strategies that helped the next generation survive their own nighttime challenges. Cultural practices that maintained identity and community despite overwhelming pressure to abandon both. This knowledge often went unrecorded in official histories. Written records were kept by people in power, and people in power rarely experienced the nighttime ordeals we've been discussing. Or if they did, they had resources and support that made the experience fundamentally different. So most of what we know about common people's nighttime survival comes from fragments, brief mentions in letters and diaries, court records when something went wrong, archaeological evidence of how spaces were used, oral histories passed down through generations, though those are complicated by distance and the way memory transforms over time. But even fragmentary knowledge tells us something important. Tells us that nighttime survival was a central part of colonial American life. That darkness shaped society in profound ways. That the choices people made after sunset had consequences that rippled through entire communities and across generations. The nighttime economy of bakers and watchmen and night soil collectors. The nighttime resistance of enslaved and indigenous peoples. The nighttime terrors of captives and prisoners and disaster survivors. All of this is American history, just not the version that usually gets taught. Maybe part of why these stories remain in darkness, metaphorically speaking, is because they're uncomfortable. They don't fit narratives about progress and civilization. They show the brutality and suffering that underpinned colonial society, show how much of that society was built on nighttime horrors that people with power chose not to see or acknowledge. It's easier to focus on daytime history, on political debates and battles and economic development, on the things that happened in public spaces during daylight hours when witnesses and records existed. But nighttime history is where much of actual life happened, where people were most vulnerable and most themselves, where social masks could drop slightly because fewer people were watching, where survival required different skills than the ones valued in daytime society. The woman maintaining her night vigil with a knife in Jamestown. The indigenous runners carrying knotted cords through darkness. The enslaved people whispering revolution in ship holds. The children learning to hide in cellars and stay silent. The bakers fighting sleep to make morning bread. The lighthouse keepers climbing stairs to maintain lights. None of these people appear in the standard histories, but they were there, living through their nights, surviving or not surviving, creating the lived reality that the big historical events happened within and depended upon. Someone had to bake the bread that fed the people making political decisions. Someone had to maintain the lights that allowed ships to navigate safely and bring goods and people. Someone had to do the nighttime labor that kept colonial society functioning. And someone had to survive the nighttime horrors that colonial society created. The raids and fires and storms and attacks, prisons and slave ships and witch trials, the poverty and disease and danger that intensified in darkness. Those survivors are part of history too. Their nighttime experiences shaped them, shaped their children, shaped the communities they were part of, shaped what was possible and what was forbidden, what was remembered and what was forgotten. As we finally approach the end of this long nighttime journey, maybe the question to sit with is, what do we inherit from these stories? We inherit the resilience, certainly, the knowledge that humans can survive extraordinary suffering, that we can adapt to terrible circumstances and find ways to keep going. That's valuable, even if it's uncomfortable to acknowledge why that resilience was necessary. We inherit the trauma too, not directly for most of us, but intergenerationally, culturally. The ways that nighttime violence and oppression shaped social structures and power dynamics. The ways that survival strategies became cultural practices that persist even when the original dangers have changed. We inherit the silence, the things that couldn't be spoken about because speaking meant reliving, the stories that got lost because the people who lived them didn't have the power or platform to record them, the absences in the historical record that are themselves a kind of evidence. And maybe we inherit a responsibility to remember these stories even though they're difficult, to acknowledge the nighttime survival that made everything else possible, to honor the people who lived through darkness and found ways to continue, not by romanticizing their suffering, not by pretending their trauma made them stronger or better, but by witnessing their experiences honestly, by recognizing their humanity and agency, even in circumstances designed to destroy both. The woman in the well in Jamestown who never slept again, she survived. That matters. But what also matters is acknowledging that her survival came at a cost she carried for the rest of her life, that she deserved better than just survival, deserved safety and healing and peace. The runners moving through darkness, coordinating the Pueblo revolt. They succeeded. That matters. But what also matters is acknowledging why that resistance was necessary. What the Spanish colonization had done that made people willing to risk everything for freedom. The enslaved people whispering in ship holds. Some of them survived to plan revolts. That matters. But what also matters is acknowledging the millions who didn't survive, whose stories are lost except as statistics in shipping records, whose nighttime suffering was so extreme that death sometimes seemed like the merciful outcome. Joseph, who spent 40 years unable to sleep properly after hiding in a well during a raid. He survived and built a life. That matters. But what also matters is acknowledging that survival isn't the end of the story. That trauma continues. That healing is possible, but not inevitable and never complete. These acknowledgments don't change the past, can't undo the suffering or bring back the dead, but they change how we hold history, how we understand where we come from, and what that means for where we might go. The nighttime hours we've explored over the course of this script were hours of fear and pain and survival. But they were also hours of resistance and connection and stubborn humanity. Hours when people made choices that mattered. When small acts of kindness or courage or simple persistence made the difference between life and death. The Wampanoag women sitting with Mary Rowlandson while she cried. The older prisoner comforting the younger one who'd lost her children. The baker taking on an apprentice for companionship. Nanny carrying a crying child while teaching escape routes. These moments don't redeem the larger horrors. Don't make the suffering worthwhile or meaningful. But they do show something important about human nature. That even in the worst circumstances, we reach for each other. Try to ease each other's pain. Recognize our shared humanity and respond to it. That capacity exists alongside our capacity for cruelty and violence. Both are real. Both shape history. And nighttime, with its concealment and its intensification of fear, brought out both capacities in stark relief. The colonial Americans we've been discussing weren't heroes or villains in any simple sense. They were people trying to survive in difficult circumstances. Sometimes that meant doing things we'd consider brave or admirable. Sometimes that meant doing things we'd consider horrific. Often it meant both, because survival is messy and complicated and doesn't fit neatly into moral categories. The enslaved people planning revolt were surviving. The overseers enforcing slavery were part of a system of survival for their communities. Both can be true even though one is clearly more justifiable than the other. Survival doesn't automatically confer moral righteousness, but it does explain behavior in ways that pure moral judgment sometimes obscures. This isn't moral relativism. Some of the nighttime practices we've discussed were absolutely wrong. Slavery was wrong. Colonial violence against indigenous peoples was wrong. The Salem witch trials were wrong. Saying these things were survival strategies for some people doesn't make them less wrong. But understanding them as survival strategies helps us understand how they persisted, how ordinary people participated in or tolerated horrors, how systems of oppression maintained themselves through generations, not because everyone involved was evil, but because survival often meant perpetuating harm. And that's uncomfortable to sit with. Easier to imagine clear divides between good people and bad people, heroes and villains. But nighttime survival in colonial America rarely offered that clarity. Offered instead complicated humans making impossible choices in darkness. So, what do we do with these stories now? How do we honor the nighttime survival of our ancestors without romanticizing their suffering or excusing their harm? Maybe we start by listening, by paying attention to the stories that have survived, by filling in the silences with imagination disciplined by evidence, by acknowledging what we don't know while taking seriously what we do know. Maybe we recognize that survival isn't enough, that the people in these stories deserved not just to survive, but to thrive, that the fact that they survived nighttime horrors doesn't make those horrors acceptable or inevitable. Maybe we look at our own nighttime anxieties and trace them back. Understand what we've inherited and why. Make conscious choices about which survival strategies still serve us and which ones we can release. Maybe we create space for the stories that don't fit the usual narratives, the nighttime experiences that shaped history from the shadows, the survival that happened in silence and darkness, the humanity that persisted despite everything trying to destroy it. And maybe, on some quiet night when you're lying in your safe bed in your lit room, you remember them. The people who survived nights you can barely imagine, who found ways to keep going when giving up would have been easier, who passed forward life and knowledge and stubborn resistance to erasure. Their nights are over. Their struggles ended long ago, but their stories remain, whispered through centuries, waiting in darkness, ready to speak if we're willing to listen. So listen, remember, witness. That's what we owe them. That's what we inherit from their nighttime survival. Not just the fact that they endured, but the responsibility to acknowledge that they did, to make their suffering and their resistance and their humanity visible, even though the darkness tried to hide it all. Part 14. The last candle as dawn approaches, both literally in this script and metaphorically in our journey through nighttime colonial America. There's one more thread worth pulling: the relationship between individual nighttime survival and collective memory. Because here's something interesting about trauma and darkness. Individual experiences of nighttime horror often get absorbed into collective narratives that transform them. Communities create shared stories about the terrible nights they survived. And those stories do important work, but they also obscure the individual experiences they're meant to preserve. Take the Jamestown starving time. It's remembered as a collective disaster. The colonists starved. They resorted to cannibalism. Only 60 survived. These are the historical facts we memorize. But each of those 60 survivors had their own specific nighttime experiences, their own particular horrors and choices and moments of despair or grace. The woman with the knife who never slept, the man who killed and ate his pregnant wife, the people who locked themselves away, the people who tried to help each other. All of those individual nights get collapsed into one story about the starving time, and something is lost in that collapse. The specificity, the humanity, the complicated reality of what survival actually looked like for particular people in particular moments. This happens with all the nighttime events we've discussed. The Salem witch trials become a story about mass hysteria. The Middle Passage becomes a story about the horror of slavery. The Pueblo Revolt becomes a story about indigenous resistance. All true, all important, but all smoothing over the jagged edges of individual experience. The woman giving birth by candlelight to a baby who died in prison. The boy who cried while learning escape routes in the maroon settlement. The apprentice baker learning to stay awake through long nights. The lighthouse keeper talking to ghosts. These specific humans with their specific nighttime ordeals don't quite fit into the big historical narratives, so they get forgotten, or reduced to examples, or mentioned in passing as illustration of larger points. Their nights become data points rather than lived experiences. But those nights were real, were lived by actual people who had hopes and fears and relationships and all the complicated, messy reality of being human, who weren't thinking about how they'd be remembered by history while they were trying to survive until dawn, who were just trying to get through the immediate darkness. And maybe that's the most important thing to remember as we close this exploration, that all of this happened to real people, not historical figures, not examples or symbols or representatives of larger trends. Real people whose nighttime suffering was immediate and personal and all-consuming in the moment. The teenager hiding in a well, submerged in freezing water, listening to his family being killed. He wasn't thinking about colonial violence or indigenous resistance or historical patterns. He was thinking about the cold, about staying still, about whether he could hold out long enough, about his mother's scream he'd just heard, about whether he wanted to survive if his family was gone. That's what nighttime survival actually looked like. Not grand narratives, but immediate, visceral, specific experience. Cold water, screaming, fear, the physical sensation of forcing your body to stay still when every instinct says run. The emotional devastation of realizing everyone you love is probably dead. History tends to zoom out, tends to look for patterns and meanings and lessons, and that's valuable. We need that larger perspective to understand how the world works. But occasionally, it's worth zooming in, worth sitting with the specific nighttime experiences of specific people, worth acknowledging that behind every historical fact are countless individual nights that can't be fully captured by any amount of historical analysis. Rebecca Nurse praying through the night before her arrest. That was a real night. A real woman lying in darkness, feeling dread creep over her, trying to convince herself she was being paranoid, trying to prepare herself for what she somehow knew was coming. Sarah Good crying in prison darkness after her infant died. That was a real night. A real woman grieving in chains, surrounded by strangers who couldn't help her, knowing her baby's death was just one more piece of the nightmare her life had become. The Pueblo runners moving through desert darkness, carrying knotted cords. Those were real nights. Real people navigating terrain by starlight, carrying information that could save or doom entire communities, managing their fear because the resistance needed them to succeed. Every single nighttime experience we've discussed in this script was real, happened to someone, mattered to them absolutely, even if it's now just a footnote in history books or a detail in a longer narrative. And here's the thing, we can never fully know what those nights were like, can never fully access the interior experience of people long dead. The historical record gives us fragments, account books and court testimonies and letters and diaries, archaeological evidence and oral histories, and careful extrapolation from what we do know. But there are gaps, silences, things that can't be recorded or transmitted. The exact quality of fear someone felt, the specific thoughts that went through their mind, the sensory details that weren't deemed important enough to write down. So when we talk about nighttime survival in colonial America, we're always partly imagining. Using what evidence, we have to construct narratives that make sense, that help us understand, that let us connect across centuries to people whose lives were fundamentally different from ours, but whose humanity was identical. And maybe that act of imagination, disciplined by evidence, but ultimately creative, is itself a form of honoring, of refusing to let the silences be the last word, of insisting that these people and their experiences matter enough to be remembered even when the record is incomplete. The woman in Jamestown, whose name we don't know, sitting with her knife through night after night. We don't know her thoughts, don't know her prayers or curses, don't know if she had children she was grieving, don't know what she told herself to get through each night, but we know she existed. No, she survived. No, she sat there in darkness with that knife, maintaining her vigil, refusing to give up. And in acknowledging that, in trying to imagine what that was like for her, we participate in remembering, in making sure her nighttime survival isn't completely lost to time. That's what this entire script has been attempting, to pull nighttime experiences out of the shadows of history, to make visible the survival and suffering and resistance and connection that happened after dark, to honor the people who lived through nights we can barely imagine. Not all of them successfully, not all of them heroically, just humanly, with whatever resources and resilience they could muster, making mistakes, sometimes harming others, sometimes helping others, sometimes both, always trying to make it to morning. And they did make it to morning, not all of them individually, but collectively, enough of them survived to continue, to have children and pass on stories and create the foundations that later generations built on. We're here because they survived their nights, because people kept going despite terror and trauma and loss, because humans have this stubborn capacity to continue even when continuing seems impossible. That's not a happy lesson exactly. It's tinged with sadness for all the suffering that survival required, for all the people who didn't survive, for all the trauma that got passed forward along with the life. But it's real. It's honest. It acknowledges both the horror and the resilience, both the damage and the persistence, both what was lost and what was preserved. As this script finally comes to its close, as we prepare to release you from this long nighttime vigil of stories and history and imagination, maybe there's one last thing worth saying. These stories matter, not because they teach us simple lessons, not because they make us feel better about our own difficulties, not because they prove anything particular about human nature or history or survival. They matter because they're true, because they happened, because real people lived through real nights, and their experiences deserve to be acknowledged even though they're painful to sit with. They matter because nighttime survival shaped America in ways we're still living with, because the trauma and resistance and adaptation that happened in darkness influenced everything that came after. They matter because everyone deserves to have their suffering witnessed, their survival recognized, their humanity acknowledged, even across centuries, even when the details are fragmentary, even when we can never fully understand what they experienced. So thank you for staying with these stories, for sitting through hours of nighttime horror and survival and complicated human experience, for not looking away from the difficult parts, for bearing witness to people who lived and struggled and sometimes broke and sometimes persevered through nights that tested the limits of human endurance. Their nights are over now. The darkness they feared has lifted. The threats they faced have faded into history, but their stories remain. And in remembering them, in refusing to let the nighttime experiences be forgotten, we honor their survival, honor their suffering, honor their humanity. May we carry their stories forward with care. May we learn what there is to learn without romanticizing or oversimplifying. May we acknowledge the complexity of survival without losing sight of the individuals who did the surviving. And may we, in our own safer, easier nights, remember them. The people who fought darkness, who whispered resistance, who maintained vigilance, who held their children, who sat with knives, who ran through forests, who climbed lighthouse stairs, who endured chains, who made bread, who survived. The dawn is here now. Both in this script and one hopes in your own timeline as you listen. The nighttime journey is complete. The stories have been told as well as we can tell them across the distance of centuries. Rest now if you can. Sleep, knowing that the nighttime horrors we've explored are past, that you're safe in ways those people never were. That morning has come and will come again, but remember them. In that space between waking and sleeping, in the quiet moments of your own nights, remember the people who survived colonial American darkness, who made it possible for there to be mornings after, who passed forward life despite everything. Their nights echo still in the darkness. Their survival whispers through time. Listen, remember, bear witness, and rest. The candle flickers one last time and goes out. The stories settle into silence. Morning light begins to filter through the window. The nighttime vigil is complete.